Carl Jung explained, 14 spiritual clues that a woman's spirit is growing beyond relationships. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about the unconscious mind. It wasn't about archetypes or dreams or the collective shadow. It was about women who disappeared. Not physically, not into affairs or breakdowns or the cliched midlife crisis that our culture loves to diagnose and dismiss. They disappeared spiritually, right in front of their partners, right in the middle of perfectly functional relationships, right at the moment when everything was supposed to finally make sense. And Jung recognized it immediately, because he'd seen it before, in his own home. Let me be clear about something from the start. What I'm about to share with you has been systematically suppressed from mainstream Jungian psychology for nearly a century. Not because it's untrue, but because it threatens the foundational story our civilization tells itself about women, love, and what it means to be whole. Jung documented this phenomenon extensively in his private case notes. He watched it unfold in both of the women closest to him, his wife Emma and his colleague Toni Wolff. He wrote about it in coded language in his Red Book, disguising it as encounters with archetypal figures when it was actually direct observation of a psychological metamorphosis that terrified him. Because what Jung discovered was this: there comes a precise moment in certain women's psychological development when their soul begins to outgrow the container of romantic partnership itself. Not the specific relationship, not the specific partner, but the entire archetypal framework of finding completion through union with another human being. And when this happens, when this initiation begins, the woman experiences something that looks like depression, feels like relationship dysfunction, and gets diagnosed as everything from hormonal imbalance to attachment disorder to spiritual crisis. But it's none of those things. It's the self, that central organizing archetype of wholeness that Jung spent his entire career mapping, announcing that it will no longer remain subordinate to the persona of wife, girlfriend, partner, or lover. The self is staging a coup, and the woman is caught in the middle of a war she didn't start and doesn't understand. Jung called this process relational outgrowing, though you won't find that term in most academic texts. He buried it in his later writings on the transcendent function and the second half of life. He wrote about it obliquely when discussing the hieroskamos, the sacred marriage, but he was always careful to frame it as internal alchemy rather than what it actually was: women's spirits evolving beyond the need for external romantic partnership as the primary organizing principle of their existence. Why was he so careful? Why the coded language? Why did academic psychology scrub this from the official narrative? Because if women understood this phenomenon was natural, sacred, and evolutionary rather than pathological, the entire structure of how we organize intimate relationships would collapse overnight. Think about it. Our economy depends on coupling. Our religions sanctify it. Our psychology treats partnership as the gold standard of mental health. The woman who chooses sacred solitude, who prioritizes her relationship with the self over her relationship with a partner, who experiences her spiritual growth as incompatible with traditional partnership, she becomes a threat to the collective order. So we pathologize her, we medicate her, we send her to therapy to fix her commitment issues. We tell her she's afraid of intimacy, running from vulnerability, sabotaging happiness. But Jung knew better. In his private journals from 1918 to 1923, during the period when both Emma and Toni were undergoing this exact transformation, Jung wrote something that never made it into his published works. The woman who individuates beyond relationship becomes incomprehensible to the collective. She appears to be rejecting love when she is actually accepting a greater love, the love affair between ego and self. But this truth cannot be spoken aloud without making her an exile from the tribe. An exile from the tribe. That's what this video is about. Because right now, in this moment, there are millions of women experiencing the early stages of this initiation. They're lying in bed next to partners they care about, feeling a restlessness they can't name. They're scrolling through social media looking at relationship advice that makes them feel physically ill. They're having dreams of ancient temples and walking alone through vast landscapes, waking up with tears on their faces that aren't sad. They're sacred. And they think they're broken. They think they're selfish, commitment phobic, emotionally unavailable, damaged by past trauma, unable to sustain healthy love. But what if they're not broken at all? What if they're being initiated into a stage of psychological development that Jung documented but our culture has refused to acknowledge? This video will give you 14 specific markers, psychological, spiritual, and archetypal signs that a woman's spirit is growing beyond the container of relationship, not beyond love itself, not beyond connection or intimacy or partnership, beyond the belief that those things must be the center of her existence for her to be whole. These 14 clues come directly from Jung's case notes, his Red Book symbolism, his observations of female analyses during midlife transition, and modern depth psychology research that's finally beginning to catch up with what Jung knew a century ago. But I need to warn you about something before we go further. If you're a woman watching this and you recognize yourself in what's coming, your life is about to change. Not because of this video, but because recognition activates what was already dormant. Jung understood that consciousness cannot be unlearned. Once you see the pattern, once you understand that what you're experiencing has a name and a trajectory and a sacred purpose, you cannot go back to sleep. And that means you'll have to choose between betraying the collective expectations of who you should be and betraying the self's demand for wholeness. There is no comfortable middle ground. If you're a man watching this, trying to understand why the woman in your life is changing in ways that feel like abandonment, this video will reframe everything. You're not losing her to someone else. You're not losing her to depression or crisis or some character flaw. You're witnessing her soul demanding primacy, and your only choice is to either grow alongside her into a completely different paradigm of relationship, or to let her go with grace. This isn't a video about relationship problems. This is a video about the evolution of feminine consciousness that happens when a woman completes the developmental tasks of the first half of life and the unconscious begins preparing her for the second half. It's about what Jung called the dangerous privilege of becoming who you truly are. And it always, always begins with a woman feeling allergic to her own life. So let me ask you something. Have you been experiencing this? Have you felt yourself changing in ways that make you uncomfortable? Have you noticed that relationship advice makes you angry rather than hopeful? Have you had dreams of walking away into landscapes that feel more real than your waking life? Have you looked at your partner and felt love alongside a terrible knowing that something in you is being called elsewhere? If yes, then keep watching, because what you're about to learn will either save your sanity or save your soul, maybe both. But understand this, Jung documented that this transition, when navigated unconsciously, destroys women. It leads to psychotic breaks, complete ego dissolution, chronic depression, or what he called living death, remaining physically present in a life that the soul has already abandoned. The only way through is conscious suffering, intentional dissent, and a willingness to become unrecognizable to everyone who knew you before. The 14 clues we're about to explore aren't just symptoms. They're breadcrumbs left by your unconscious to guide you through the most dangerous and sacred transition a woman can experience. Jung himself barely survived witnessing this transformation in the women around him. It shattered his theories, it humbled his ego, it forced him to completely revise his understanding of feminine psychology, and when he emerged on the other side, he wrote something in his private notebooks that I'll share with you at the end of this video. Something about what happens when a woman finally completes the hieroskamos, the sacred marriage with her own self, and returns to the world carrying that wholeness. But first, we need to understand the problem itself. The psychological condition that millions of women are experiencing right now without a name for it, without a roadmap, without permission to honor what's actually happening. Jung called it Relational Containment Syndrome, and it's destroying women who were made for wholeness. Let's begin. There's a particular kind of suffering that happens to women around the age of 35 to 45, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. But there's a window when it strikes with devastating precision, and our entire psychological establishment has completely misdiagnosed it. Jung first noticed this pattern in 1913 during his own descent into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. But it wasn't his own breakdown that taught him about this phenomenon. It was the women who came to him for analysis during those years. Successful women, intelligent women, women who had done everything right. They'd chosen good partners, built stable relationships. Many had children. They'd cultivated careers or created beautiful homes, or both. On paper, their lives looked exactly like what women are supposed to want. And yet they sat in Jung's office, describing a kind of death. Not suicidal ideation exactly, not clinical depression, though that's what their doctors called it. Something else, something that Jung eventually labeled Relational Containment Syndrome in his private case notes, a term that never made it into his published works because he knew what it would unleash. Here's what the syndrome looks like from the inside. The woman wakes up one morning and feels nothing about the relationship rituals that used to give her life meaning. Making dinner together, weekend getaways, long conversations about feelings and future plans, sex that's supposed to be connecting but feels like she's watching herself from outside her body. None of it is bad. That's what makes it so confusing. Her partner isn't abusive. He's not neglectful. Often he's attentive, loving, trying his best. The relationship isn't broken in any conventional sense, but something in her has shifted. Some tectonic plate in her psyche has moved, and suddenly the entire architecture of her life feels like a costume she's wearing for someone else's play. She starts having dreams, vivid, numinous dreams that Jung would recognize immediately as archetypal. Dreams of walking alone through ancient temples, dreams of transformation, dying in one form and being reborn in another, dreams of vast open landscapes where she's traveling without destination, just moving, just becoming, and she wakes from these dreams with a feeling that's simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like she's being called, like something is waiting for her, like her soul has an appointment with a future that has nothing to do with the life she's built. During the day, she goes through the motions. She functions, but there's a voice underneath everything now. Quiet at first, then growing louder. It says things like, "This isn't your life. This was never your life. You've been living for the collective, for the archetype of partnership, for everyone's expectations except your own soul's trajectory." And the guilt, the crushing guilt of these thoughts, because she's been taught her entire life that a woman's happiness comes through relationship, that her value is measured by her ability to sustain partnership, create harmony, be the emotional center that holds everything together, that if she's not happy in relationship, something is wrong with her, not with the paradigm itself. So she goes to therapy, and the therapist, operating from conventional relationship psychology, tries to help her work through what must be unresolved childhood attachment wounds, or communication problems, or unrealistic expectations about partnership. The therapist never once considers that what she's experiencing might be evolution rather than pathology. Meanwhile, her body starts speaking in symptoms: unexplained fatigue, loss of libido, not because she's not attracted to her partner, but because her erotic energy is being redirected somewhere else, somewhere inward, somewhere the collective doesn't have a map for. She might start feeling physically ill during couple activities. Going to dinner parties with other couples makes her want to scream. Watching romantic movies that she used to enjoy now feels like propaganda. Relationship advice, no matter how well-meaning, makes her angry in ways she can't articulate. And the worst part? The isolation, because she can't talk about this. If she tells her friends, they'll worry about her marriage. If she tells her partner, he'll feel rejected, abandoned, not enough. If she tells her mother, she'll hear about sacrifice and commitment and how grass is always greener. No one understands that this isn't about the relationship being bad. It's about her soul outgrowing the container that partnership provides. Jung saw this pattern repeat in woman after woman during midlife, and he recognized something crucial. This wasn't random neurosis. This was the psyche's attempt to initiate the woman into the second half of life, where the task is no longer adaptation to collective expectations, but individuation, becoming who she actually is rather than who she was conditioned to be. But here's where it gets dangerous. The psyche doesn't care about convenience. It doesn't care about your mortgage or your children's stability or your partner's feelings or what your community thinks. When the self decides it's time to emerge from behind the persona of good partner, it will burn down whatever needs to burn to make space. And if the woman resists, if she suppresses this call because she's terrified of the consequences, Jung documented what happens. The symptoms intensify. The dreams become more urgent, more violent. The body escalates from fatigue to chronic illness. The psyche starts producing what Jung called symptomatic messages, panic attacks, during intimate moments, complete emotional numbing, or sudden obsessive attractions to unavailable people or spiritual teachers or idealized versions of solitude. These aren't signs of dysfunction. They're the unconscious screaming, "You're dying by staying. Your soul is suffocating. Get out, get out, get out." But get out to where? That's what makes this so disorienting, because this isn't about leaving a relationship for another relationship. This isn't about finding the right partner who will finally complete her. This is about recognizing that the entire framework of seeking completion through partnership is a collective story that has become a prison. Jung called this recognition the death of the relational persona. And it's an actual death. The woman who believed her value came from being chosen, being loved, being essential to someone else's happiness. That woman has to die. And in her place, something that has no name in our culture, something our psychology has no category for. A woman who is complete unto herself. A woman whose primary relationship is with her own psyche, her own unconscious, her own process of becoming. A woman who can choose relationship from fullness rather than need. But here's the trap our culture has set. We call this selfishness. We call it fear of commitment. We call it inability to sustain intimacy. We pathologize it as avoidant attachment or narcissistic wounding or spiritual bypassing. And many women, hearing these labels, collapse back into the old patterns. They medicate the restlessness. They force themselves to perform enthusiasm about partnership. They sign up for another relationship workshop, read another book about conscious loving, try harder to feel what they're supposed to feel. And the soul starves. The self, that central organizing principle of wholeness that Jung devoted his life to understanding, gets shoved back into the unconscious. And the woman spends the rest of her life wondering why she feels half alive, half present, half real. This is what Jung meant by relational containment syndrome. The healthy, evolved, sacred movement of a woman's psyche towards self-completion gets contained, suppressed, and pathologized until the woman herself believes she's the problem. But she's not the problem. The collective story about women and relationships is the problem. Jung wrote about this most directly in his essays on the second half of life. He observed that men and women face different psychological tasks as they age. For men, the task is often developing the feminine, becoming more emotionally aware, more connected, more relational. But for women who've already spent the first half of life mastering relationship, mastering emotional labor, mastering the arts of connection and care, the second half demands something radically different. It demands they become selfish. It demands they withdraw their energy from the collective. It demands they stop making everyone comfortable and start making themselves whole. And this, Jung noted, is when women become truly dangerous to the patriarchal order, not because they're angry, not because they're destructive, but because they're no longer available to perform the role of emotional container for everyone else's chaos. They become interested in their own chaos, their own unconscious, their own transformation, and a woman interested in her own soul, rather than everyone else's comfort, is a woman the collective cannot control. This is why this phenomenon has been suppressed. This is why you won't find it in mainstream psychology textbooks. This is why women experiencing this feel so alone. Because acknowledging this pattern, acknowledging that women's spiritual development naturally leads them beyond relationship as center, would require our entire civilization to restructure itself around a different story. A story where women don't need to be completed by men, where partnership is optional rather than essential, where a woman's value isn't measured by her ability to sustain romantic love, but by her commitment to her own wholeness. That story hasn't been told yet, not widely, not with cultural permission, but it's the story your unconscious is trying to tell you through symptoms, dreams, restlessness, and that terrible knowing that something has to change. Jung called women in this transition threshold beings, standing between the first half of life and the second, between collective conditioning and individual truth, between the safety of known roles and the terror of becoming unknown, even to themselves. And threshold is exactly where you are if you're experiencing this, not broken, not damaged, not commitment phobic or emotionally unavailable, initiating, transforming, being called by the self into a version of yourself that the collective has no category for. But here's what Jung also knew. This transition, when navigated unconsciously, can destroy you. It can lead to complete ego dissolution, psychotic breaks, shadow inflation where you become contemptuous of all relationship, or regression into eternal adolescence disguised as spiritual freedom. The threshold is dangerous. Many women don't make it across. They either collapse back into old patterns or explode into chaos that ruins everything they've built. The only way through is conscious suffering, intentional work, understanding the psychological territory you're entering and what tools you need to navigate it. And that's what the rest of this video will give you. Not a quick fix, not a way to make this comfortable, but a map through the territory that Jung himself barely survived understanding, a map he created by watching women transform and trying to articulate what he saw. But first, you need to hear one specific story, one woman's journey through this initiation that will show you what's actually happening beneath the surface, because when you see it clearly in someone else, you'll finally recognize it in yourself. And recognition, as Jung knew, is the first step toward consciousness. Her name was Maria. At least that's what we'll call her. Jung was careful about protecting the identity of his female patients, especially those experiencing what he called dangerous individuations. Maria came to Jung in 1921. She was 42 years old, married for 17 years, two children, 14 and 11, upper middle class, well-educated. Her husband was a successful physician. On the surface, her life looked exactly like success. She arrived at Jung's office because her doctor, ironically, a colleague of her husband's, had diagnosed her with melancholic depression and suggested she seek psychological treatment before resorting to more drastic medical interventions. Jung's case notes from their first session record something striking. Maria wasn't crying. She wasn't anxious or agitated. She sat in his office with what he described as eerie calm and said simply, "I think I'm disappearing." Not suicidal ideation, not dissociation. Disappearing. Jung, who had been developing his understanding of the individuation process through his own recent descent into the unconscious, immediately recognized this statement as symbolic rather than literal, so he asked her to elaborate. What Maria described changed Jung's understanding of feminine psychology forever. She told him that about 18 months earlier, she'd woken up one morning and felt nothing about her life. Not depression exactly, not numbness, more like she was watching someone else's life from behind glass. She got up, made breakfast for her family, kissed her husband goodbye, and went through her entire day feeling like an actress in a play she hadn't auditioned for. At first, she thought it was temporary, fatigue, perhaps some physical ailment. But weeks passed, then months, and the feeling intensified rather than faded. What disturbed her most and what made her seek Jung's help was that she found herself increasingly repelled by her marriage. Not by her husband as a person. He hadn't changed. He was still kind, responsible, reliable. But something about the intimacy between them had become intolerable. She would lie next to him at night, this man she had loved for nearly 2 decades, and feel like she was in bed with a stranger, not because he was foreign to her, but because she had become foreign to herself. She started having dreams. This was what finally drove her to Jung, because the dreams were so vivid, so numinous, that she couldn't dismiss them as random neurological firings. In one recurring dream, she was walking through an ancient temple, Greek or Roman, she wasn't sure. The columns were massive, the space vast and echoing. She was completely alone. And in the dream, this solitude wasn't lonely. It was sacred. It was the most right thing she'd ever felt. She would wake from these dreams crying, not sad tears, something else. Jung's notes describe them as tears of recognition, as if the soul were remembering something the ego had forgotten. During their sessions, Jung began to probe her history. What he discovered was a pattern he would see repeated in dozens of female patients over the coming decades. Maria had spent her entire adult life in service to the relational archetype. She'd been an exceptional girlfriend, then an exceptional wife, then an exceptional mother. Her identity was entirely constructed around being essential to others. But here's what Jung found crucial. She'd been good at it. This wasn't a case of failed relationships or inability to connect. She had succeeded completely at the collective task of being a relational woman. And that success, Jung realized, was precisely what had triggered the crisis. Because the psyche, Jung understood, only moves to the next developmental stage when the previous one is complete. Maria's soul was attempting to initiate her into what Jung called the second birth, the shift from living for the collective to living from the self. But she had no framework for understanding this, no cultural permission, no map. So she interpreted the symptoms as dysfunction. She thought she was broken. She came to Jung believing he would help her recommit to her role as wife and mother. Instead, he told her something shocking. You're not dying of depression. You're dying of unlived life. Jung's approach with Maria was radical for his time. He didn't try to fix her marriage. He didn't suggest communication skills or rekindling romance. Instead, he introduced her to active imagination, a technique where she could dialogue directly with the unconscious figures appearing in her dreams. In one of their sessions, Jung instructed Maria to close her eyes and imagine herself back in that temple, to walk through it consciously, to see if anyone or anything was there. What emerged from those sessions is recorded in Jung's private notes, and it's extraordinary. Maria encountered what Jungian psychology would later call her inner self figure, a wise old woman who told her that her soul had been waiting for this moment for decades, waiting for Maria to complete her relational tasks, waiting for Maria to be ready for the next journey. And what was that journey? The wise woman told her, to become a whole person, you must become no one's person. You must die to being wife, mother, beloved. These are roles, not truth. The temple is where you go to remember you are not a fragment of others' lives, but a complete circle unto yourself. When Maria opened her eyes and shared this with Jung, she was shaking, because the message was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that her marriage, as currently structured, was incompatible with her soul's next stage of development, not because her husband was wrong for her, but because she had constructed her entire identity around being his wife, rather than being herself. Over the next 2 years of analysis, Jung guided Maria through what he would later call the hierosgamos process, the sacred marriage with one's own self. But it wasn't smooth, it wasn't easy, and it nearly destroyed her before it saved her. Maria began claiming time for solitude, hours alone where she wasn't available to her family. Her husband was confused, then worried, then angry. He accused her of having an affair. He suggested she was mentally unstable. He pressured her to stop seeing Jung, whom he viewed as encouraging her to abandon her responsibilities. Her children noticed the change too. Mom was present but distant, going through the motions but clearly somewhere else internally. Maria's social circle started whispering. Women friends who had always relied on her for emotional support felt abandoned. Dinner party invitations dwindled because her energy had shifted. She was no longer interested in performing the role of gracious hostess. This is the dangerous part of the initiation that Jung documented so carefully. The woman begins to shed her relational persona, but she hasn't yet established a new center of gravity. She's in the void, the abyss, the space between death and rebirth. Jung's notes from this period show Maria struggling with almost unbearable guilt. She loved her children, she cared about her husband, but something in her simply could not continue investing her life energy primarily into relationship. She told Jung during one session, "I feel like I'm being ripped in half. Part of me wants to go back to who I was, to stop causing this pain, but there's a stronger part now that would rather die than betray what's emerging." Jung recognized this as the critical threshold moment. This was where many women turned back, unable to tolerate the discomfort they were causing others or the chaos in their own psyches. But something in Maria's unconscious had already crossed the point of no return. She began having a new kind of dreams where she was simultaneously her normal self and the wise woman from the temple. Dreams where she was making love not to her husband, but to some invisible presence that Jung identified as the self, the hierosgamos, the internal sacred marriage. These dreams were intensely erotic, but not sexual in the conventional sense. She would wake from them feeling more whole, more alive than any external relationship had ever made her feel. And this is when the breakthrough happened. Maria came to a session and told Jung that she'd made a decision. She wasn't leaving her husband, she wasn't abandoning her children, but she was going to stop living as if relationship was the center of her existence. She told her husband that she needed to live separately for a period of time, not to date others, not to escape, but to complete something in herself that couldn't be completed while remaining enmeshed in the daily rhythms of partnership. Her husband was devastated. He didn't understand. How could he? The collective story said that if a woman loved you, she wanted to be with you. Maria's request made no sense in that framework, but Jung encouraged her to trust the process, to honor what the unconscious was demanding. So Maria moved into a small apartment across town. She saw her children regularly. She remained legally married, but she created what Jung called sacred distance, the space necessary for individuation. The guilt was crushing at first. Her husband went through cycles of anger, pleading, and cold withdrawal. Her children felt confused and hurt. Her social circle essentially ostracized her. A married woman living alone was scandal in 1920s Zurich. But something else was happening simultaneously. Maria began painting. She'd never painted before, never considered herself artistic, but images from her active imagination sessions demanded to be externalized. She created what Jung later recognized as spontaneous mandalas, circular images representing the self's movement toward wholeness. She studied. She read philosophy, mysticism, alchemy. She started attending Jung's lectures on analytical psychology. She was becoming something that had no name in her culture, a woman individuating beyond relationship. Jung's notes from this period reveal his own struggle to understand what he was witnessing. He'd developed theories about individuation based primarily on male psychology, where the second half of life often meant becoming more relational, more connected to feeling. But Maria was showing him something different. Women who had successfully mastered relationship in the first half of life didn't need to develop it further in the second half. They needed to develop what had been sacrificed to relationship: autonomy, creative power, direct connection to the unconscious, authority from self rather than from being chosen by others. After 18 months of separation, Maria and her husband reunited, but everything had changed. She returned not as wife, but as sovereign individual who chose partnership from wholeness rather than need. Her husband had undergone his own transformation during the separation. Forced to develop capacities he'd always relied on her to provide, forced to confront his own incompleteness. Their marriage became what Jung called conscious relationship. Two individuated beings choosing connection without fusion, intimacy without enmeshment. But here's the crucial part that Jung emphasized in his case notes. This resolution only happened because Maria had been willing to betray the collective expectations. She'd been willing to be called selfish, difficult, broken. She'd been willing to risk everything, her marriage, her children's comfort, her social standing, to honor the self's demand for primacy. Most women, Jung noted, were not willing to take that risk. They would feel the same call Maria felt, experience the same dreams and symptoms, but ultimately suppress them to preserve the relational container. And those women, Jung documented, paid a terrible price: chronic illness, complete loss of vitality, living death, physically present but spiritually gone. Maria's story became a template for Jung's understanding of feminine individuation in the second half of life. He would return to her case again and again in his private seminars, using her journey to illustrate what he called the necessary selfishness of the individuating woman. But he was always careful about how much he shared publicly, because he knew that Maria's resolution was rare. Most husbands wouldn't tolerate 18 months of separation. Most women couldn't withstand the social condemnation. Most families would fracture under the pressure. Maria had succeeded because she'd had several factors in her favor: financial resources, no history of trauma that would complicate the process, a constitutional strength that could tolerate extreme psychological pressure, and Jung's guidance through the most dangerous phases. But what about women without those advantages? women with children dependent on them financially, women in communities where such behavior would result in complete social exile, women without access to depth psychological understanding. Jung worried about this for the rest of his career. He documented a real, natural, sacred process of feminine psychological development, but he'd also seen how dangerous it was to navigate without proper support. This is why he was so careful about what he published. This is why his most detailed observations about feminine individuation remained in private case notes and seminar transcripts that weren't released until decades after his death. Because he knew that naming this process would activate it in women who might not be ready. An activation without preparation could lead to disaster. But here's what he also knew. The process happens whether women are ready or not, whether they have support or not, whether the culture has language for it or not. The self will demand wholeness. The question is only whether the ego will cooperate consciously or be dragged through the transformation unconsciously. Maria's story shows the conscious path, the path where a woman recognizes the signs, does the internal work, makes the terrifying choices, and emerges on the other side as someone genuinely new. But her story also shows the cost, the necessary sacrifice, the death that precedes rebirth. And that's what makes this particular psychological phenomenon so difficult for our culture to integrate. We want growth without loss, transformation without death, evolution without sacrifice. But Jung knew, and Maria demonstrated, that genuine individuation always requires losing something. For women individuating beyond relationship, what gets lost is the identity built around being essential to others' happiness. And in its place, something our culture still doesn't have adequate language for. A woman who is complete, who can love without needing, who can connect without losing herself, who brings wholeness to relationship, rather than seeking wholeness through relationship. Jung called this the twice-born woman, the woman who has died to collective conditioning and been reborn from the self. And he believed these women were the future of feminine consciousness, the harbingers of a new way of being that would eventually become the norm rather than the exception. But we're not there yet, which is why women experiencing this still feel so alone, still pathologize themselves, still believe they're broken rather than transforming. Maria's story exists to show you you're not broken, you're becoming, but becoming requires death first, and the death is real. The question is, are you willing? What Jung observed in his female patients between 1913 and 1950 has finally begun to receive scientific validation, not under the same language, not with explicit reference to his work, but the neuroscience, developmental psychology, and consciousness research of the past 2 decades is confirming precisely what he documented. Women's brains undergo a profound transformation during midlife that reorients their psychological priorities away from external relationship and toward internal integration. Let's look at what science has discovered. In 2019, a landmark study published in the journal Neuroscience of Consciousness examined brain activity patterns in women aged 35 to 55 using advanced fMRI technology. What they found was startling. Women in this age range showed significantly increased connectivity between the brain's default mode network, the neural system responsible for self-referential thought and introspection, and the salience network, which determines what information the brain prioritizes as meaningful. In practical terms, this means that women's brains during midlife become structurally more interested in internal experience than external validation. The neural reward systems that once fired strongly in response to social approval and relational harmony begin to reorganize around self-generated meaning. The researchers noted something they called social reward dampening. Women who had previously shown high neural activation when receiving positive feedback from romantic partners showed significantly reduced activation during the same experiments after age 40. The researchers were puzzled. They initially interpreted this as a form of depression or emotional flattening, but when they correlated the brain data with self-reported life satisfaction scores, they found something unexpected. The women with the strongest social reward dampening reported higher overall well-being and greater sense of purpose. They weren't becoming depressed. They were becoming self-referenced. This is precisely what Jung meant when he talked about the shift from persona to self during the second half of life. The brain is literally rewiring to prioritize internal psychological work over external relationship maintenance. Another study, this one from Stanford Center for Developmental Biology, examined hormonal shifts in women during perimenopause and menopause. What they discovered challenges the simplistic narrative that attributes women's midlife changes purely to hormonal fluctuation. Yes, estrogen and progesterone levels change dramatically, but those hormonal shifts produce predictable effects: hot flashes, sleep disruption, mood variability. What they don't explain is the specific psychological orientation that develops during this period. The sudden prioritization of solitude, the loss of interest in conventional romantic dynamics, and what the researchers called purposeful social withdrawal. The Stanford team found that women's oxytocin response patterns, the neurochemical associated with bonding and relationship, undergo a fundamental reorganization during midlife. Women who had previously experienced strong oxytocin surges during intimate partnership activities showed significantly reduced responses after age 42. But here's the fascinating part. Those same women showed dramatically increased oxytocin production during solitary creative activities, spiritual practices, and what the researchers termed self-reflective engagement. Their bodies were literally shifting the neurochemical reward structure away from bonding with others and toward bonding with themselves. Jung would have recognized this immediately as the hieroskamos, the sacred marriage, shifting from projection onto external partners to actualization within the psyche itself. The research on women's spiritual development during midlife is even more revealing. A comprehensive meta-analysis published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology examined over 50 years of data on mystical experiences, spiritual awakening, and what they called consciousness expansion events in women. The findings: women's most profound spiritual experiences cluster overwhelmingly between ages 38 and 52, and these experiences correlate strongly with periods of relational withdrawal rather than relational engagement. Women who reported the most intense mystical states, encounters with the numinous, ego dissolution experiences, profound unity consciousness, were significantly more likely to be in periods of deliberate solitude, or what the researchers called relationship pause. This directly contradicts the cultural narrative that women's spiritual development happens through connection, through community, through partnership. Instead, the data suggests that women's deepest spiritual awakenings require withdrawal from the relational field. Jung's concept of individuation as a process that intensifies during the second half of life has received robust support from developmental psychology research. Studies on adult development have identified what Erik Erikson called generativity versus stagnation as the central tension of midlife. But recent research has refined this understanding specifically for women. A longitudinal study following 500 women from age 35 to 65 found that women who successfully navigated midlife demonstrated a clear pattern. They shifted from what researchers termed care-based identity to purpose-based identity. care-based identity meant defining themselves primarily through their roles as partners, mothers, daughters, friends, their value derived from caring for others. Purpose-based identity meant defining themselves through their work, creative expression, spiritual practice, or contribution to collective evolution. The women who made this shift successfully reported significantly higher life satisfaction, better physical health, and what researchers called authentic self-coherence, the feeling that their outer life matched their inner truth. The women who remained stuck in care-based identity showed dramatically higher rates of depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness, and what Jung would have called living death, physically present but spiritually absent. This research validates Jung's observation that women who've successfully mastered relationship in the first half of life must pivot to a completely different developmental task in the second half. Not improving their relationships, not deepening their relational capacity, but discovering who they are when no one needs them. Neuroscience has also confirmed something Jung intuited but couldn't measure. The integration between brain hemispheres increases dramatically in women during midlife. Research using DTI imaging, which tracks neural pathway development, shows that the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerves connecting left and right hemispheres, actually thickens in women between ages 40 and 55. This increased integration means women during this period develop enhanced capacity for what researchers call abstract spiritual cognition, the ability to hold paradox, perceive symbolic meaning, and access non-rational knowing. In practical terms, women become more capable of understanding themselves through archetypal, mythic, and spiritual frameworks. They become more interested in depth than surface, meaning than maintenance, transformation than stability. Jung noticed this in his female analysins. They would arrive seeking help with practical relationship problems, but quickly become fascinated by the symbolic dimension of their experience. Dreams, synchronicities, archetypal patterns. The brain was literally reorganizing to prioritize depth psychological work over conventional problem solving. Research on the empty nest phenomenon has also shifted dramatically. Early psychological studies framed this transition as loss, women grieving the departure of children and struggling to find new purpose. But recent longitudinal research tells a completely different story. Women experiencing empty nest report a spike in life satisfaction, creative productivity, spiritual seeking, and what researchers call identity reclamation. Brain imaging studies on these women show something remarkable. The neural networks that had been devoted to caretaking and anticipating others' needs actually begin to redirect that energy towards self-exploration and personal development. The brain is reclaiming resources, energy that was flowing outward toward maintaining relationships and meeting others' needs begins flowing inward toward individuation. Jung understood this as the natural progression of the second half of life. The first half requires adaptation to collective expectations, developing the ego, establishing relationships, creating stability. But once those tasks are complete, the psyche redirects toward the ultimate task, becoming whole. For women specifically, becoming whole means integrating the parts of themselves that were sacrificed to the relational persona, the autonomy that was suppressed to maintain partnership, the creative power that was channeled into supporting others' dreams, the spiritual authority that was projected onto teachers, partners, or children. Contemporary research on women's mystical experiences has revealed something Jung hinted at, but never fully articulated. Women's encounters with the divine shift fundamentally during midlife. Studies analyzing women's descriptions of spiritual experiences show that before age 40, Women most commonly describe encountering the sacred through relationship, feeling connected to God through love for children, experiencing the divine through service to others, finding meaning through communion with partners. After age 40, the language shifts dramatically. Women begin describing direct encounters with the divine that bypass relationship entirely. Unity experiences, dissolution of boundaries, merging with consciousness itself. The mystical traditions have always known this. The Christian mystics, Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, all began their most profound spiritual work after withdrawing from conventional relational life. In Eastern traditions, this is formalized as the transition from householder to renunciate, the stage where spiritual seekers withdraw from family duties to focus exclusively on liberation. But Western psychology has pathologized this exact same transition in women. We call it depression, midlife crisis, empty nest syndrome, menopause-induced instability. Jung knew better. He recognized it as the psyche's natural progression toward wholeness. But even he struggled to articulate this clearly because his own cultural conditioning made it difficult to imagine women's highest development involving withdrawal from relationship rather than deepening of relationship. Modern research on attachment theory has also begun to challenge its own foundational assumptions. Traditional attachment theory, developed primarily by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, posited that secure attachment was the gold standard of mental health, the ability to form stable, lasting bonds with others. But recent research on earned secure attachment and what some researchers call post-relational integration suggests a different possibility, that beyond secure attachment lies something else, a stage where individuals can engage in relationship from fullness rather than need, where attachment becomes conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Women in midlife who report decreasing interest in romantic partnership don't show markers of insecure attachment. They show markers of what researchers tentatively call autonomous attachment, the capacity for deep connection without dependency, intimacy without enmeshment. This is precisely what Jung meant by the individuated individual, someone who has completed the psychological work of becoming whole and can therefore relate to others without projection, without need, without losing themselves. The research on women's creativity during midlife also validates Jung's observations. Studies show that women's creative output, whether in art, writing, music, or intellectual work, often peaks between ages 45 and 60. But it's not just increased productivity. It's a qualitative shift in the nature of the creative work. Women during this period create from a different source. The work becomes more archetypal, more mythic, more concerned with universal themes than personal narratives. Jung would recognize this as the self beginning to express through the individual. The creative work is no longer ego-driven, trying to prove something, seeking approval, establishing identity. It becomes what he called objective work, art that serves the collective unconscious, that gives form to archetypal energy. This requires the woman to have separated from identification with persona. She can't be creating to maintain her identity as good partner or successful woman. She has to create from the void, from the space beyond role. Neuroscience research on meditation and contemplative practice has revealed something else Jung would have appreciated. The brain changes associated with long-term solitary spiritual practice are remarkably similar to the spontaneous brain changes observed in women during midlife. Areas associated with self-referential thought become more active. The default mode network shows increased integration. The capacity for what researchers call non-dual awareness, experiencing consciousness without subject-object division, becomes more accessible. In other words, women's brains during midlife are spontaneously moving toward states that monks and mystics spend decades cultivating through practice. The psyche is initiating women into mystical consciousness, whether they consciously seek it or not. The symptoms that get diagnosed as depression or relationship dysfunction are actually the birth pangs of expanded consciousness. But without a framework to understand this, without Jung's map, women interpret these brain changes as breakdown rather than breakthrough. A particularly fascinating study from the University of California examined what happens in long-term relationships when one partner undergoes this midlife transformation. They tracked 150 couples where the woman reported experiencing relational outgrowing, the sense that her spirit was moving beyond partnership. 20% of those relationships ended within 2 years. But here's what happened in the 80% that survived. Both partners underwent profound individuation. The crisis that the woman's transformation created forced both people to separate from unconscious fusion and develop into more complete individuals. The relationships that survived didn't look like the original relationships. They transformed from unconscious unions based on mutual dependency into conscious partnerships between two sovereign beings. Jung predicted exactly this. He wrote that mature love could only exist between two individuated individuals. Everything else was projection, fantasy, or psychological fusion disguised as intimacy. But getting from unconscious union to conscious partnership required what he called conscious suffering, the willingness to let the old relationship die so a new one could emerge. Most couples, Jung noted, were unwilling to endure that death. They would rather maintain the familiar dysfunction than risk the transformation. The research also examined what happened to women who suppressed the call, who felt the symptoms of relational outgrowing but forced themselves to remain in the old patterns. The health consequences were severe. Significantly increased rates of autoimmune disease, chronic pain, depression requiring medication, and what researchers called vital exhaustion, a state of complete depletion that resembled burnout but couldn't be resolved through rest. Jung saw this in his practice repeatedly. Women who suppressed the individuation call didn't just experience psychological symptoms. The body rebelled. The unconscious, when blocked from psychological expression, would manifest through physical illness. He called this the wisdom of the symptom. The body forcing the woman to stop, to withdraw, to turn inward because the psyche's direct messages were being ignored. Modern psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how psychological states affect immune function, has validated Jung's observation. Chronic suppression of authentic psychological development produces measurable changes in immune system function, inflammatory markers, and stress hormone regulation. The body knows when the soul is dying, and it will create symptoms that force the issue. All of this research, neuroscience, developmental psychology, consciousness studies, relationship research, health outcomes, points to the same conclusion Jung reached. Through decades of clinical observation, women undergo a natural, healthy, necessary psychological transformation during midlife that requires withdrawal from relationship as center and reorientation toward self as center. This isn't pathology, it's evolution. But our culture lacks the framework to support this transition. We still pathologize it, medicate it, try to fix it, and women experiencing it still feel broken rather than transforming. The question is, now that the science is catching up with Jung's observations, will we finally create cultural containers for this sacred transition? Or will we continue forcing women to choose between betraying their souls and betraying collective expectations? Because make no mistake, the research shows that the call happens whether we acknowledge it or not. The only variable is whether women navigate it consciously or suffer through it unconsciously. And that's what the next section will help you understand. The specific signs that this transformation is activating in your own psyche. The 14 clues that your spirit is outgrowing the container of relationship, not to frighten you, but to prepare you. Because as Jung knew and as modern research confirms, consciousness is the only way through. These aren't just symptoms, they're breadcrumbs, messages from your unconscious, guiding you toward a transformation that your culture has no language for. Jung developed his theory of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, partially from watching women recognize themselves in archetypal patterns. The recognition itself, he believed, was part of the individuation process. Seeing the pattern activates what was dormant. So as you read these 14 clues, understand, if you recognize yourself here, something has already begun. The question is only whether you'll participate consciously. Clue 1. You're becoming allergic to relationship narratives. This is usually the first sign. You're scrolling through social media and every post about love languages or conscious coupling or keeping the spark alive makes you feel physically ill, not intellectually critical, not just uninterested, actually repelled. You used to consume this content eagerly. You collected relationship advice like tools for a craft you were trying to master. But now every Instagram quote about partnership feels like propaganda. Every relationship podcast feels like indoctrination. Jung would identify this as the ego's initial rebellion against the relational persona. The part of you that built your identity around being good at relationships is dying, and the dying process begins with nausea, your psyche literally trying to purge what no longer serves. The archetypal pattern here is the death of the maiden and the birth of the crone. In mythology, this transition always begins with the woman refusing the conventional romance narrative. She turns away from the prince, walks past the wedding, disappears into the forest. Your unconscious is trying to tell you that story isn't your story anymore. Shadow element. You might become contemptuous of women still invested in relationship. This is inflation, the ego identifying with being beyond something rather than integrating the lesson. Watch for superiority. It's a sign you're inflating rather than individuating. Working with it. Notice when the physical revulsion arises. What specific narratives trigger it? Write them down. You're not rejecting relationship. You're rejecting the collective story about what relationship should mean for your identity. Clue 2. Dreams of ancient feminine figures. Jung paid careful attention to dream symbolism, especially when archetypal figures appeared. If you're beginning to dream of old women, priestesses, goddesses, or ancient feminine authority figures, your unconscious is introducing you to what he called the self-figure, the archetypal representation of your wholeness. These aren't random dreams, they're initiatory. The figures often appear in temples, at thresholds, in liminal spaces. They sometimes speak directly, offering wisdom or warnings. Sometimes they're silent, but their presence feels more real than waking life. Women going through this transition commonly report dreams of Sophia, divine wisdom, the oracle, the hermit, the queen alone in her tower, the crone at the crossroads. These figures represent the aspect of yourself that has always existed beyond your roles, beyond your relationships, beyond your persona. Jung called this the eternal aspect of the psyche, the part that doesn't die with the ego's identifications. Shadow element. You might start believing you're special, chosen for some mystical destiny. This is spiritual narcissism. These figures aren't appearing because you're superior. They're appearing because you're ready to stop being special and start being whole. Working with it. Keep a dream journal. When these figures appear, use Jung's active imagination technique. Close your eyes, re-enter the dream space, and dialogue with them. Ask, what do you want me to know? What am I resisting? Clue 3. Solitude feels erotic. This is one of the most confusing signs because it contradicts everything women are taught about desire and fulfillment. You start craving time alone with an intensity that feels almost sexual, not lonely, not depressed, hungry for solitude the way you once hungered for connection. And when you get it, when you have a day entirely to yourself, you feel a kind of aliveness that relationship hasn't provided in years, maybe ever. Jung understood this as the beginning of the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. The erotic energy that was once directed toward external partners is turning inward, seeking union with the self. This isn't sublimation, it's not suppression, it's redirection toward what Jung called the ultimate partner, your own wholeness. In alchemical symbolism, this stage is represented by the hermaphrodite or the divine androgen, the figure who contains both masculine and feminine principles within. You're beginning to experience yourself as complete, not as half-seeking its other half. Shadow element. You might use this as justification to completely withdraw from human contact. This is the schizoid defense, using spirituality to avoid the legitimate vulnerability of intimacy. True individuation leads to more conscious relationship, not less relationship. Working with it, honor the craving. Schedule solitude as sacred time with intention and ritual, but also maintain connection. The goal is sovereignty, not isolation. Clue 4. Loss of romantic fantasy. The fantasies that used to sustain your relationship imagination have died. You can't access them anymore. You used to be able to imagine future romance, trips together, growing old hand in hand, the perfect wedding anniversary. These fantasies provided hope, motivation, sweetness. Now when you try to imagine them, nothing happens. It's not that you imagine something negative, it's that your psyche no longer generates romantic narrative at all. This terrifies most women because we're taught that the absence of romantic fantasy means the relationship is dying. But Jung would identify this as something entirely different, the death of projection. Romantic fantasy is built on projection, projecting your inner wholeness onto another person and imagining that union with them will complete you. When that capacity dies, it's not because love is dying. It's because the psyche is reclaiming the projections. The archetypal pattern is the queen alone in her castle. She doesn't need rescue. She doesn't dream of princes. She's discovered she is both queen and kingdom. Shadow element. You might conclude that you're incapable of love or that all relationship is illusion. This is relational nihilism. The death of fantasy doesn't mean the death of connection. It means the possibility of real connection begins. Working with it, grieve the fantasies. They were beautiful, even if they were based on projection. But don't confuse their death with your own death. You're not ending, you're beginning. Clue 5. Partners become transparent archetypes. You start seeing your partner and all potential partners as archetypal figures rather than as the special individual who will complete your life. He's not him anymore. He's the warrior, the king, the wounded healer, the eternal boy. You can see the archetype operating through the person, and the person becomes almost transparent. This is disconcerting because it feels like you're losing intimacy. How can you love someone you see through? But Jung understood this as advanced perception. You're beginning to see how the unconscious uses human relationships to work out archetypal dynamics. You're waking up from what he called participation mystique, unconscious fusion with another. This doesn't make relationship impossible. It makes conscious relationship possible for the first time, because you can finally see what's actually happening beneath the personal level. Shadow element. You might become cynical, reducing all human connection to just archetypes. This misses the point. Seeing the archetypal level doesn't negate the personal. It adds depth to it. Working with it. Study Jungian archetypes. Learn to identify the patterns in yourself and others. This isn't detachment, it's enhanced perception that allows for more conscious engagement. Clue 6. Self as primary relationship. There's a moment when something shifts. You realize with shocking clarity that your most important relationship is with yourself, not your partner, not your children, not your friends, yourself. This feels selfish, narcissistic, wrong, because you've been taught your entire life that women who prioritize themselves over relationships are damaged, broken, or traumatized. But Jung knew this shift was essential for individuation. He called it establishing the ego-self axis, the conscious relationship between your ego, your daily self, and yourself, your wholeness. Without this primary internal relationship, all external relationships become unconscious dependencies. You use others to complete yourself because you haven't completed the internal marriage. The archetypal pattern is Psyche's journey. She must complete tasks alone, descend to the underworld alone, face death alone, before she can reunite with Eros as a goddess rather than a mortal girl. You can't skip the alone part. The alone part is where you become whole. Shadow element. You might weaponize this insight using working on myself as an excuse to avoid commitment or accountability. This is the puer puella defense, eternal adolescence disguised as spiritual development. Working with it. Establish daily practices that strengthen the ego-self relationship. Meditation, journaling, active imagination. Treat this as seriously as you once treated romantic relationship. Clue 7. Synchronicities. Increase in solitude. Jung's theory of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that can't be explained by causality, becomes experiential rather than theoretical during this transition. You start noticing that when you're alone, following your inner guidance, synchronicities multiply. The right book appears. The perfect teacher shows up. Answers to questions you hadn't asked arrive through random conversations, dreams, or nature. This isn't magical thinking. Jung understood synchronicity as evidence of the unconscious organizing reality when the ego gets out of the way. When you stop forcing outcomes, stop manipulating reality toward relational goals, the self can begin choreographing your development. These synchronicities rarely happen in the context of relationship because relationship keeps you in ego mode, planning, managing, performing. But alone, following the pull of the unconscious, you start experiencing what Jung called meaningful chance. The universe confirming that you're on the right path. Shadow element. You might start believing you're cosmically special or that the universe is personally invested in your journey. This is inflation. Synchronicity happens to everyone who individuates. You're not chosen, you're conscious. Working with it. Keep a synchronicity journal. Track the patterns. Notice what conditions create the most meaningful coincidences. Usually, solitude, openness, following intuition rather than logic. Clue 8. No longer seeking completion. This is subtle but profound. You realize you've stopped seeking, not just seeking in the romantic sense, seeking the one who will make everything click, but seeking in general, seeking validation, seeking purpose through others, seeking identity through roles. The seeking has stopped because something has been found, not found externally, found internally. Jung called this discovery of the self, not the ego, the self. The organizing center that was always there but couldn't be perceived while you were identified with persona and projection. Women describe this as feeling complete for the first time, not in a triumphant way, in a quiet, settled way. Like arriving home after a lifelong journey, the archetypal pattern is the Grail quest completed, not by finding the external Grail, but by realizing you were the Grail all along. Shadow element. You might conclude that growth is over, that you've arrived. This is premature closure. The self reveals itself in layers. This is a milestone, not the destination. Working with it, notice the absence of seeking. Feel what fills that space, usually presence, awareness, curiosity without desperation. This is the ground from which conscious relationship becomes possible. Clue 9. Sexuality redirects to spiritual energy. Your libido doesn't disappear, it transforms. The sexual energy that once sought expression through partnership begins redirecting toward what mystics call spiritual eros. You might find yourself less interested in sex, but more interested in meditation, creativity, nature, or ecstatic experience. The same energy, different direction. Jung understood libido as life force, not just sexual drive. In the second half of life, he observed that libido naturally redirects from biological relational purposes toward spiritual creative purposes. This is what Kundalini Yoga describes as energy rising from lower to higher chakras, what Christian mystics described as divine marriage, what alchemists called sublimation. You're not becoming asexual, you're becoming differently erotic, eroticizing life itself rather than just partnership. Shadow element. You might use this as justification to completely abandon sexual relationship, claiming spiritual superiority. This can be bypassing. True integration includes the body, working with it. Explore somatic spiritual practices, Kundalini Yoga, tantric breathwork, movement meditation. Let the sexual energy inform your spiritual practice rather than splitting them apart. Clue 10. Attraction to hermit crone archetype. You find yourself drawn to images, stories, and symbols of the woman alone. The hermit, the crone, the witch in the woods, the wise woman at the edge of the village. This isn't about literal isolation. It's about archetypal resonance. Your psyche is preparing for initiation into the crone, the stage of feminine development that comes after maiden, youth potential, and mother, creation, nurture. The crone isn't defined by age. She's defined by initiation, by withdrawal from collective expectations, by claiming authority from self rather than from being chosen, needed, or validated by others. In fairy tales, the crone lives at the threshold, the edge of the village, the boundary between worlds. She's both feared and sought. Feared because she represents death of the old self. Sought because she holds the wisdom required for transformation. You're being called to that threshold, to become the woman at the edge, who no longer needs approval from the center. Shadow element. You might romanticize isolation, using the crone archetype to justify misanthropy or superiority. The true crone remains available to the community even while living at the edge. She's not hostile. She's sovereign, working with it. Study crone mythology, Baba Yaga, Hecate, the Norns, the Morrigan. These aren't sweet grandmothers. They're fierce, autonomous, powerful. Let them show you what sovereignty looks like. Clue 11. Seeing through animus projections. Jung's concept of the animus, the masculine principle within a woman's psyche, becomes experiential. You start recognizing that every external man you've ever been attracted to was carrying a projection of your own internal masculine. The qualities you sought in partners, strength, protection, authority, direction, action, weren't really about them. They were about the undeveloped masculine within you. This recognition is devastating and liberating simultaneously. Devastating because you realize how much energy you've spent seeking externally what was always internal. Liberating because you can finally stop seeking. The work now becomes integrating the animus, developing your own internal masculine qualities rather than projecting them onto partners and then feeling abandoned when those partners fail to embody your projection. Jung called this withdrawing projections, and he considered it essential work for the second half of life. As long as you're projecting your inner wholeness onto others, you remain dependent on relationship for completion. Shadow element. You might flip into identifying with masculine qualities and rejecting everything feminine. This is animus possession, the masculine overtaking the ego instead of being integrated. Balance is key. Working with it, use active imagination to dialogue with your animus. Give him form, a figure who appears in meditation or dreams. Ask what he needs from you, how he wants to serve your wholeness rather than being projected outward. Clue 12. The hierosgamos experience. This is the most mysterious and least discussed sign. At some point, you experience what Jung called the hierosgamos, the sacred marriage within. It might come in a dream, a meditation, a spontaneous visionary experience, but it's unmistakable. You experience yourself as both lover and beloved, masculine and feminine, self and other merged in internal union. This isn't metaphor, it's phenomenological. Women describe feeling more fulfilled by this internal experience than by any external sexual relationship they've had. Jung understood the hierosgamos as the goal of individuation, the conscious union of opposites within the psyche that creates wholeness. Every external romantic relationship, he believed, was an unconscious attempt to experience what can only be achieved internally. Once you've experienced the hierosgamos, external relationship can never be the same. You can't unsee that you are already whole. You can't unknow that union happens within. This doesn't make partnership impossible, but it makes partnership optional rather than essential, which terrifies the collective. Shadow element. You might conclude that external relationship is unnecessary or inferior. This is spiritual bypassing. The hierosgamos should make you more capable of conscious relationship, not less. Working with it. If you haven't experienced this yet, you can't force it, but you can prepare through meditation, active imagination, and what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Not resolving contradiction, but letting it exist within you until synthesis occurs spontaneously. Clue 13. Collective relationship rituals feel empty. Couple dinners, anniversary celebrations, Valentine's Day, wedding showers. The entire social machinery around romantic partnership begins to feel hollow, not annoying, not offensive, empty, like watching people perform elaborate rituals for a god you no longer believe in. You can still participate, you can be gracious, but internally you know you're performing. The genuine investment in these collective rituals has evaporated. Jung would identify this as separation from the collective unconscious, the first stage of individuation where you stop unconsciously participating in collective values and start choosing consciously what resonates with your individual truth. The collective celebrates partnership because the collective needs people coupled, domesticated, integrated into the social order. But your soul is no longer serving the collective. It's serving the self. This creates profound loneliness. You're surrounded by people celebrating something that feels meaningless to you. You're at the wedding, the baby shower, the anniversary party, and you're utterly alone. Shadow element. You might become contemptuous of people still invested in these rituals, seeing them as unconscious or immature. This is inflation. Their journey isn't your journey. Allow them their truth. Working with it. Stop performing. Stop attending events that drain you. Create new rituals that actually honor what you're becoming. And be honest, I'm going through something. I can't participate in this right now. Clue 14. Called by something nameless. The final sign is the hardest to articulate. You feel called, pulled, summoned by something you can't name. Not a specific goal, not a career or relationship or geographical move. Something beyond form, something your soul recognizes even though your mind can't conceptualize it. Jung called this the call to individuation. He understood it as the self demanding that the ego surrender its control and allow the unconscious to lead. This call feels like destiny, like you have an appointment with something that's been waiting your entire life, like your soul knows exactly where it's going even though your ego is terrified. Women describe this as simultaneously the most frightening and most real thing they've ever felt, more real than their relationships, more real than their roles, more real than anything they can see or touch. Jung wrote, "The call is always from the self, and the self always calls you toward death. Death of who you thought you were, so who you actually are can finally emerge." Shadow element. You might use this feeling to justify impulsive, destructive choices. Not every impulse is the self-calling. Some are ego inflation, shadow eruption, or trauma reenactment. Discernment is essential. Working with it. Follow the call slowly. Don't blow up your life overnight, but also don't ignore it. Jung's method. Take one small step toward the unknown, then wait. Let the unconscious confirm through dreams, synchronicities, or internal clarity. Then take the next step. These 14 signs aren't linear. You won't experience them in order. Some women experience all 14 simultaneously. Some cycle through them over years. But if you recognize yourself in more than 5 of these, understand, you're already in the transition. The question isn't, is this happening? The question is, will I do this consciously or unconsciously? Because Jung was very clear about what happens when this process unfolds unconsciously. And that's where we go next. The 5 dangers that destroy women who navigate this transition without awareness. Jung never sugarcoated individuation. He called it dangerous. He warned that the process could lead to psychosis, inflation, or complete personality disintegration if navigated unconsciously. For women specifically, women whose entire identity has been constructed around relational success, the dangers are even more acute. Because you're not just individuating, you're individuating against the collective story about what makes a woman valuable, worthy, and whole. That kind of individuation carries specific perils. Danger. 1. Inflation and spiritual narcissism. This is the most common trap. You begin experiencing the symptoms of relational outgrowing, the dreams, the synchronicities, the sense of being called. And instead of recognizing these as signs of the self emerging, your ego identifies with them. You start believing you're special, chosen, more evolved than other women who are still caught in relationship addiction. You develop contempt for partnership, for women who still care about romance, for anything that smells like conventional relating. You surround yourself with spiritual language that justifies your superiority. I'm ascending. I'm 5D while they're 3D. I'm too awake for relationship drama. Jung called this inflation, the ego identifying with archetypal content and believing itself to be the source of the transformation rather than its vehicle. Inflation makes you insufferable. You lose friends. You alienate family. You become the woman at the dinner party lecturing everyone about consciousness while radiating judgment and superiority. And here's the most dangerous part. Inflation feels like enlightenment. It produces euphoria, certainty, and a sense of mission. You can't see that you've become a parody of individuation. Jung warned that women undergoing midlife individuation were particularly susceptible to inflation because the culture provides no positive framework for this transition. Without guidance, women swing from self-doubt to grandiosity, from "what's wrong with me" to "I'm too evolved for this world." Real consequences. You sabotage relationships that could have evolved. You isolate yourself while calling it spiritual boundaries. You attract spiritual narcissists and create echo chambers where everyone confirms each other's inflation. How to recognize it. If you feel superior to people, Still invested in relationship, you're inflating. If your spiritual development makes you kinder, more humble, more able to hold paradox, you're individuating. Jung's test: does your transformation increase your capacity for genuine human connection, or does it make you dismissive of human messiness? The antidote: shadow work, ruthless shadow work. Every quality you judge in others exists in you. Every time you feel superior, you're projecting disowned aspects of yourself. Find a Jungian analyst or depth-oriented therapist who will call you on your inflation. Surround yourself with people who won't indulge your grandiosity. Danger 2. Relational nihilism. This is the opposite extreme from inflation, but equally destructive. You conclude that because conventional relationship has failed to complete you, all relationship is illusion, all connection is codependency, all intimacy is enmeshment. You withdraw not into sacred solitude, but into defended isolation. You build walls and call them boundaries. You reject vulnerability and call it sovereignty. You become unreachable and call it spiritual maturity. Jung saw this in patients who had been wounded by relationship and used individuation as justification to never risk connection again. He called it negative individuation, using the language of growth to avoid the legitimate demands of being human. The relational nihilist believes that needing anyone for anything is weakness, that true individuation means complete self-sufficiency, that the individuated person should be an island, utterly self-contained. But Jung was clear: individuation doesn't lead to isolation, it leads to conscious relationship. The goal isn't to need no one. The goal is to relate from wholeness rather than need, from choice rather than compulsion. The woman caught in relational nihilism appears strong. She has her life together. She's independent, successful, self-sufficient. But underneath, she's terrified. Terrified of being hurt again. Terrified of losing herself in relationship. Terrified that if she opens her heart, the fragile wholeness she's constructed will shatter. Real consequences. You create a life of safety and loneliness. You mistake emotional unavailability for spiritual advancement. You age into bitterness, watching from behind your walls as life happens to other people. And your body, Jung knew this, will eventually rebel. Autoimmune disease, chronic pain, depression that can't be medicated away. How to recognize it? Ask yourself, has your spiritual growth increased your capacity for intimacy? Or has it given you sophisticated reasons to avoid it? Can you be vulnerable with anyone, or have you made vulnerability itself the enemy? The antidote: risk. Conscious, boundaried, but genuine risk. Find one person, a friend, a therapist, a spiritual director, and practice being seen. Practice letting someone witness your actual struggles, not your curated spiritual persona. Jung believed that individuation required witnesses. You can't become whole in complete isolation. Danger. 3. Shadow projection onto partnership. This is subtle and insidious. Instead of integrating your shadow, the disowned, rejected aspects of yourself, you project it entirely onto the concept of relationship itself. Relationship becomes the enemy, the obstacle, the thing that kept you from your true self all these years. You develop a narrative: I lost myself in relationship. Partnership is inherently oppressive to women. The only way to be whole is to be alone. And you're not entirely wrong. You probably did lose yourself. Many relationships are structured around women's self-sacrifice. But here's the shadow element: you're avoiding responsibility for your own unconsciousness. Jung was ruthless about this. We choose our relationships unconsciously, projecting our inner wounds onto partners who will activate those wounds, so we're forced to integrate them. Blaming relationship for your suffering is like blaming the mirror for showing you your face. The woman caught in this trap becomes an evangelist against partnership. She writes social media posts about how Healing is choosing yourself. She collects evidence of relationships' dangers, divorce statistics, domestic violence data, stories of women who sacrificed everything. She's not wrong about the data, but she's using the data to avoid her own shadow, the part of her that chose unconsciously, stayed unconsciously, performed unconsciously, the part that gave away her power and now wants to blame the institution rather than integrate the lesson. Real consequences. You never develop the capacity for conscious relationship. You carry the same wounds into every interaction, just wrapped in spiritual justification. And you potentially influence other women away from necessary relationship work by making partnership itself the villain. How to recognize it. If you speak about relationship with contempt, anger, or missionary zeal about its dangers, shadow projection. If you can speak about your own unconscious participation in relationship dynamics with compassion and accountability, integration. The antidote, retrieve your projections. Every relationship you've had was with yourself. Projections of your animus, your shadow, your unlived life. Do the inventory. What patterns repeat? What did you avoid seeing? What responsibility have you deflected? Jung's method. Treat every past partner as a dream figure revealing something about your own psyche. Danger 4. Regression into puer puella. Jung identified the puer eternus, eternal boy, and puella eterna, eternal girl, as archetypal patterns of arrested development, the person who refuses to grow up, commit, or take responsibility for their life. The danger here is that spiritual individuation can become a sophisticated justification for developmental stagnation. You use language like honoring my flow and following my authentic truth to avoid commitment, discipline, or accountability. You blow up your life impulsively, quit your job, end your relationship, move across the country, and call it answering the soul's call. But Jung was clear. Genuine individuation requires what he called conscious suffering, the willingness to stay with difficulty, work through resistance, integrate rather than escape. The woman regressed into puella uses spiritual language to justify perpetual reinvention. She never stays long enough anywhere to build anything substantial. She mistakes movement for growth, change for transformation. She's allergic to limitation, commitment, structure. She wants freedom without responsibility, transformation without the death that precedes it. Jung saw this pattern frequently in his practice. People who came to analysis seeking permission to abandon their lives rather than guidance to transform them. He would confront them. You're not seeking individuation, you're seeking escape. Real consequences. Financial instability, broken relationships everywhere, inability to build anything lasting, and underneath it all, despite the spiritual language, a profound emptiness, because transformation requires staying, integrating, working through, and you keep running. How to recognize it? Look at your history. Do you have a pattern of starting things with enthusiasm and abandoning them when they get difficult? Do you use spiritual language to justify instability? Jung's question, what are you running from? The antidote, stay, just stay. Choose one thing, a relationship, a practice, a project, and commit to it for a specific period, not forever. Just long enough to work through your resistance to limitation. Jung believed that consciousness develops through constraint, not through infinite possibility. Danger 5. Psychotic break. This is the most severe danger, and Jung took it seriously. When the self emerges too rapidly, too intensely, without adequate ego strength to contain it, the result can be complete personality disintegration. The boundary between ego and unconscious collapses. You lose the ability to distinguish between internal psychological reality and external consensus reality. Dreams bleed into waking life. Synchronicities become persecution. The voice of the self becomes auditory hallucination. Jung himself nearly experienced this during his Red Book period. He wrote about being menaced by a psychosis during his confrontation with the unconscious. He survived because he maintained his clinical work, his family relationships, his connection to consensus reality, even while exploring the depths. But many women going through this transition don't have that grounding. They're already isolated, already questioning everything, already destabilized by the death of their relational identity. And if the unconscious erupts too forcefully, through ayahuasca journeys, intensive meditation retreats, isolation, or simply spontaneous activation, the ego can shatter entirely. Jung called this being devoured by the unconscious. The woman loses her personality structure entirely. She might believe she's a goddess incarnate. She might develop paranoid delusions. She might lose the ability to function in practical reality. This isn't metaphorical. Jung documented cases of women who entered midlife individuation without proper support and ended up in psychiatric institutions, diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, when what they were actually experiencing was uncontained archetypal possession. Real consequences: hospitalization, loss of children, career, relationships. Years or decades of trying to reconstruct a functional ego, or permanent disability, spending the rest of your life unable to distinguish psychological reality from consensus reality. How to recognize it. Warning signs include losing the ability to function in daily life, believing you have special cosmic mission that supersedes normal human responsibility, experiencing communications from entities or guides that command your behavior, inability to distinguish between symbols and literal reality. The antidote: grounding, ruthless grounding, daily embodied practices, walking, cooking, cleaning, maintaining work and relationships even when they feel meaningless, professional support from someone trained in Jungian or transpersonal psychology who understands the difference between spiritual emergence and psychotic break, and humility, recognizing that your ego is a necessary structure, not something to dissolve entirely. Jung wrote something crucial about these dangers in his later work. He observed that women were simultaneously more vulnerable to these perils and more capable of surviving them than men. More vulnerable because women's egos are often less developed, constructed around relationship and collective expectations rather than around autonomous achievement and individual authority. More capable of surviving because women, Jung believed, had more direct access to the unconscious. They were more comfortable with paradox, symbol, and non-rational knowing. But survival, he emphasized, required consciousness, required understanding what was happening psychologically, rather than just experiencing it emotionally or somatically. These 5 dangers aren't theoretical. They destroy women daily. Women who feel the call to individuation but lack the map. Women who recognize the symptoms of relational outgrowing but interpret them through cultural frameworks that pathologize rather than honor the transformation. Every danger listed here can be avoided, but only through conscious work, only through understanding the psychological territory you're entering and what tools you need to navigate it. And that's what comes next. Not the problems, the solutions. Jung's actual methodology for guiding women through this transition. The practices, frameworks, and stages that allow you to undergo this death and rebirth consciously rather than being destroyed by it unconsciously. Because Jung did develop a roadmap, he just never made it mainstream, never packaged it for mass consumption, kept it primarily in his seminars, his case notes, his work with individual analysands. But the roadmap exists, and it works, if you're willing to do the actual work rather than just consuming the concepts. Jung didn't just diagnose this phenomenon. He developed a specific methodology for navigating it, a blueprint for conscious individuation that transformed dozens of women from psychological crisis into authentic wholeness. But understand something crucial before we dive into his solution. Jung's method isn't comfortable. It isn't quick. It doesn't promise that your relationship will survive or that your life will look recognizable on the other side. What it promises is this: if you do the work, you will become real. You will stop living as a collection of roles and personas and start living from your actual center. You will discover who you are when no one is watching, when no one needs you, when all the masks fall away. And that person, that essential, authentic, whole person, is worth every sacrifice required to meet her. Step 1. Shadow integration. Retrieving your projections. Jung was adamant, you cannot individuate without integrating your shadow. And for women experiencing relational outgrowing, the shadow work is specific. You must retrieve every projection you've placed onto partners. Every quality you sought externally exists within you, undeveloped and disowned. Did you seek strength in your partners? That's your undeveloped strength. Did you seek direction, authority, decisiveness? Your undeveloped masculine. Did you seek spiritual wisdom, emotional depth, creative inspiration? Qualities you possess but projected outward. Jung's method was direct confrontation with these projections. He would ask his female patients to write detailed descriptions of past partners, not their actual characteristics, but the idealized qualities she'd projected onto them. Then he would say, "These qualities are yours. They were never his. You saw him as a mirror of your own undeveloped potential. Now the work is developing those qualities yourself." This is devastating to realize. It means every relationship failure was actually a failure to recognize yourself. Every time you felt abandoned by a partner, you were actually abandoning undeveloped aspects of your own psyche. But it's also liberating. Because if the qualities you seek exist within you, you're no longer dependent on finding the right partner to feel complete. Practical application. Create what Jung called a shadow inventory. List every significant partner or attraction. Next to each name, write the qualities you most admired or desired in them. These are your shadow projections. Now ask, how can I develop these qualities in myself? If you projected strength, how do you develop your own strength? If you projected spiritual authority, how do you claim your own authority? This isn't about becoming masculine or rejecting feminine qualities. It's about becoming whole, integrating all aspects of human experience regardless of gender conditioning. Jung believed that shadow integration was the foundation of all individuation work. Without it, everything that follows is built on unconsciousness. Step 2. Animus dialogue. Establishing conscious relationship with your inner masculine. Jung's concept of the animus, the masculine archetype, within a woman's psyche was revolutionary. He recognized that women don't just relate to external men. They relate to an internal masculine figure that shapes their entire psychological life. Most women experience the animus unconsciously. He appears in dreams as critical voices, as commanding figures, as the men they're attracted to. When unconscious, the animus possesses the woman, speaking through her in harsh, judgmental, dominating ways. Jung's solution: establish conscious dialogue with the animus. Give him form. Let him become a figure you can interact with rather than a force that controls you. Practical application. This is Jung's active imagination technique applied specifically to animus work. Sit in meditation. Close your eyes. Invite your inner masculine to appear. Don't force an image. Let him emerge naturally. He might appear as a specific person, an archetypal figure, warrior, king, sage, or simply a felt presence. When he appears, dialogue with him. Who are you? What do you want from me? How have you been? Trying to get my attention. What gift do you bring to my wholeness? Write down his responses. Don't edit or rationalize. Let him speak. Jung found that when women established conscious relationship with the animus, everything changed. The critical inner voice became an ally, offering discernment rather than an enemy attacking self-worth. The attraction to external men shifted from compulsive need to conscious choice. The animus, integrated, becomes your connection to directed action, clear boundaries, rational thinking, and spiritual authority. All the qualities patriarchal conditioning taught you to seek in men, you discover within yourself. This is the internal hieroscamos beginning, the feminine ego, your conscious self, developing relationship with the masculine archetype within your own psyche. Step 3. Active imagination, direct communion with the self. This was Jung's core technique, the practice he used himself during his Red Book period and taught to his analysans for decades. Active imagination is a way of dialoguing directly with the unconscious. It's distinct from ordinary fantasy because you're not controlling the narrative. You're participating in a conversation with autonomous aspects of your psyche. For women going through relational outgrowing, active imagination becomes the primary way to receive guidance from the self. Because the self, your essential wholeness, knows exactly what needs to happen next, even when your ego is confused and terrified. Practical application. Set aside 30-45 minutes in undisturbed solitude. Begin with a dream image, a recurring symbol, or simply an emotion that's been present. Close your eyes. Let the image or feeling become vivid. Then step into the scene as yourself. You're both participant and observer. Interact with whatever appears. If it's a figure, speak to it. If it's a landscape, explore it. If it's an emotion, personify it and ask what it wants. The key, don't control the outcome. Let the unconscious respond. Let figures speak words you didn't plan. Let scenes develop in unexpected ways. Record everything immediately after. Jung emphasized that active imagination is useless unless you bring its insights back into consciousness through writing or art. Women practicing this during midlife transition commonly encounter the wise old woman who offers guidance for the next stage, the abandoned child who needs integration, the fierce warrior woman who offers protection during vulnerability, landscape transformations showing death and rebirth, the hieroscamos itself, symbolic union with an inner figure representing the self-active imagination, practiced consistently, becomes your direct line to the unconscious. You stop seeking guidance externally from partners, teachers, or gurus because you're receiving it directly from within. Step 4. Symbolic life creation, building a personal mythology beyond collective scripts. Jung believed that modern people suffered primarily from loss of symbolic life. We've become too literal, too practical, too divorced from the mythic dimension that gives life meaning. For women individuating beyond relationship, creating a symbolic life becomes essential. You can't just deconstruct the old relational identity. You must construct something new. This isn't about creating a new persona. It's about discovering what Jung called your personal myth, the unique symbolic story your soul is living that has nothing to do with collective expectations. Practical application. Ask yourself, if my life were a myth or fairy tale, what story am I living? Not the story you were supposed to live. Successful relationship, happy family, comfortable domesticity. The actual story, the one that includes the darkness, the descent, the transformation. Jung found that women in this transition often resonated with specific mythic patterns. Inanna's descent to the underworld, and return transformed Persephone's abduction and emergence as queen of the underworld psyche's labors and eventual divinity. The fairy tales where the woman must complete tasks alone before reunion. Study these myths. Find the one that resonates with your actual experience. Then live into it consciously. Create rituals that mark your transition. Jung was big on ritual, physical acts that embody psychological transformation. One woman Jung worked with created a death ceremony for her old identity. She burned photos, wrote letters to past selves, buried objects that symbolized her relational persona. Then she spent 3 days in silence before beginning to construct symbols of her emerging self. Another created an altar in her home, with images of the wise woman archetype, places of power she'd dreamed about, and objects representing qualities she was integrating. These aren't just creative exercises. Jung understood ritual as the bridge between conscious and unconscious, the way to anchor internal transformation in external reality. Step 5. The hieroskamos within, actualizing the sacred marriage. This is the culmination of Jung's method for feminine individuation. Everything previous prepares for this, the moment when the sacred marriage shifts from external seeking to internal actualization. The hieroskamos is the union of opposites within the psyche, masculine and feminine, ego and self, conscious and unconscious, all dualities resolving into wholeness. Jung observed that women experiencing this often reported dreams or visions of sacred sexuality, mystical union, or becoming both bride and groom simultaneously. This isn't metaphor, it's phenomenological experience. Women describe it as more fulfilling than any external relationship has ever been, because it's the experience of becoming whole, complete, no longer seeking outside yourself for completion. Practical application. You can't force the hieroskamos. It emerges when the previous work is complete. Shadow integration, animist dialogue, active imagination, symbolic life creation. But you can. Prepare for it. Meditate on the image of the divine androgen, the figure who contains both masculine and feminine principles. Let this image work on you. In active imagination, allow yourself to encounter internal figures representing your masculine and feminine aspects. Let them interact. Let them move toward union. When the hieroskamos occurs, and you'll know it when it does, it feels like coming home, recognizing yourself for the first time, complete relaxation of seeking, profound peace alongside ecstatic aliveness. Jung noted that women who experienced this often described it as being made love to by God or marrying my own soul. The language is necessarily mystical because the experience transcends ordinary consciousness. After the hieroskamos, everything changes, not in dramatic external ways necessarily, but internally the center has shifted. You no longer need relationship to feel whole. You can choose relationship from fullness rather than lack. The integration from internal work to external life. Jung was clear that individuation isn't complete when the internal work finishes. Integration requires bringing your transformation into relationship with the world. This is where many women get stuck. They do the internal work. They experience the hieroskamos. They feel whole. But then they don't know how to live that wholeness in actual relationship with others. Jung taught that individuated people don't withdraw from the world. They engage more consciously. The goal isn't isolation, it's conscious participation. So what does conscious relationship look like after individuation? First, it's no longer based on need. You can love someone without needing them to complete you, validate you, or provide your identity. Second, it's archetypal rather than purely personal. You see the patterns operating through relationship rather than believing relationship is only personal and unique. Third, it includes conscious suffering. You don't bail when things get difficult. You stay and work through conflict because you know relationship is a container for further transformation. Fourth, it maintains individuality. You don't fuse. You don't become we at the expense of I. You remain two sovereign individuals choosing connection. Fifth, it serves the self rather than ego. The relationship exists not to make you happy, but to serve your continued individuation and the individuation of your partner. Jung called this conscious relationship or psychological marriage. It's rare because it requires both people to be individuating. Most relationships are unconscious fusion, two people using each other to avoid their own wholeness. But after you've completed the internal hieroskamos, conscious relationship becomes possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. Some women complete this work and realize their current relationship can transform into conscious partnership. The partner is willing to do his own individuation work. The relationship has enough foundation to rebuild on new ground. Other women realize their current relationship cannot evolve. It was based entirely on unconscious projection and fusion, and that's okay. Better to be alone and whole than partnered and fragmented. Jung never promised that individuation would preserve your existing life. He promised it would make you real, and real means you can no longer sustain relationships built on lies, projections, or unconscious dependency. The timeline. How long does this take? People always ask Jung, how long does individuation take? His answer, the rest of your life. But the acute transition from recognizing the call to establishing a new center typically takes 2 to 5 years of consistent work. 2 to 5 years of shadow integration, animus dialogue, active imagination, ritual, and conscious suffering. 2 to 5 years of staying with the death of the old self, while the new self emerges. Jung was honest about the cost. Most people won't do this work. They'll feel the call and suppress it. They'll start the work and give up when it gets too difficult. They'll have moments of insight but return to unconscious patterns because consciousness is genuinely uncomfortable. Only a small percentage complete the journey, but those who do, Jung observed, become the culture bearers, the ones who hold consciousness for the collective, the ones who demonstrate that another way of being is possible. For women specifically, completing this individuation makes you dangerous to the patriarchal order, because you can no longer be controlled through relationship. You can no longer be manipulated through threat of abandonment or promise of validation. You become sovereign, and sovereign women threaten every system built on women's dependency. But they also become the initiators for other women, the ones who show what's possible, the ones who light the path. Jung believed this was essential work not just for individual wholeness, but for collective evolution. Each person who individuates contributes to what he called the collective unconscious, making the pattern more accessible for those who follow. Your individuation isn't just personal, it's evolutionary, but only if you do the actual work. Which means we need to look at what happens when women don't do the work, when they feel the call but respond unconsciously, because the path is littered with failures, and learning from them is as important as learning from successes. Jung understood that studying failure teaches as much as studying success, perhaps more, because failure shows you the precise points where consciousness breaks down, where the ego can't tolerate the death required for transformation. Let's look at both. Women who attempted this journey and collapsed, and women who successfully navigated the transition into wholeness. The failures, when the call destroys rather than transforms. Virginia Wolff, unintegrated animus and ultimate dissolution. Jung never analyzed Virginia Wolff directly, but he would have recognized her pattern immediately. Wolff experienced the call to feminine individuation with devastating intensity, the pull beyond relationship, the need for solitude, the creative fire that demanded everything. Her diaries reveal a woman caught between two forces, the collective expectation that she fulfill the role of wife to Leonard Wolff, and a soul that wanted something relationship couldn't provide. But Wolff never integrated what Jung would call her animus, her internal masculine principle. Instead, it remained split off, appearing in her consciousness as harsh, critical voices that attacked her relentlessly. The voices told her she was worthless, that her work was terrible, that she should die. This is animus possession, the internal masculine overtaking the ego rather than being integrated as an ally. Wolff also never established grounding practices. She would disappear into creative work for weeks, barely eating, disconnected from her body, living entirely in her mind. Then she would crash into suicidal depression. Jung would have seen this as the danger of inflation, identifying with archetypal material without adequate ego strength to contain it. Wolff channeled extraordinary wisdom and creativity, but she had no container for it. The unconscious devoured her. In 1941, she walked into a river with stones in her pockets. Jung's analysis would be compassionate but clear. Wolff experienced a genuine call to individuation, but lacked the psychological framework to navigate it. She needed what Jung would have provided: active imagination practices, shadow work, grounding in the body, and recognition that the harsh voices weren't truth but unintegrated psychic content. Her tragedy wasn't that she felt the call, it was that she navigated it entirely alone, without a map. Zelda Fitzgerald, spiritual awakening misdiagnosed as madness. Zelda Fitzgerald's story is even more tragic because she experienced classic signs of spiritual emergence, what Jung would recognize as the self-awakening, but everyone around her, including her psychiatrists, interpreted it as madness. In her late 20s, Zelda began having mystical experiences. She felt called to dance, to create, to develop her own artistic identity, separate from being F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife and muse. She had visions, synchronicities, a sense of divine mission. Her husband was terrified. Her doctors diagnosed schizophrenia. They hospitalized her repeatedly, gave her insulin shock therapy, essentially tried to eliminate the very experiences that Jung would have recognized as individuation attempting to occur. Zelda wrote in her medical records, "I am trying to become a complete person. My doctor says this is my illness." Jung would have wept reading that, because it's exactly what he feared: genuine individuation being pathologized by a medical establishment that had no framework for spiritual emergence. Zelda never integrated her experiences. She couldn't because everyone told her they were symptoms of disease rather than stages of development. She died in a hospital fire in 1948, still diagnosed as schizophrenic, her individuation completely suppressed. Her failure wasn't personal, it was collective. The culture's failure to provide any framework for women's spiritual development beyond relationship. Sylvia Plath, Inflation into the Death Mother Archetype. Plath's late poetry reveals a woman possessed by what Jung called the terrible mother archetype, the destructive feminine that devours rather than nurtures. Her poems from the months before her suicide are filled with images of death, destruction, and rage at domesticity. She's clearly experiencing the death of her relational persona, the perfect wife poet who could sustain both marriage and artistic greatness. But instead of integrating this death as one stage of transformation, Plath inflated into the archetype itself. She became the death mother. Her rage at her husband, at domesticity, at motherhood itself consumed her. Jung would recognize this as what happens when shadow material erupts without conscious integration. Plath's shadow, everything she'd suppressed to be the good wife and mother, exploded, but instead of integrating it, her ego identified with it entirely. She wrote, "I am a riddle in 9 syllables to an elephant, a ponderous house." She saw herself as monstrous, too big for conventional life, destructive to everything she touched. This is inflation of the shadow, and it's lethal. In February 1963, Plath sealed her children's room, turned on the gas, and put her head in the oven. Jung's analysis: she experienced a genuine call to move beyond the relational persona, but lacked the grounding, the shadow integration, and the symbolic framework to navigate it. The call destroyed her because she met it unconsciously. The successes: women who navigated the journey consciously. Toni Wolff, Jung's colleague and her own woman. Toni Wolff is the success story Jung himself witnessed and documented. She was his patient, then his colleague, then his intellectual equal, and she navigated the exact transition we're discussing with remarkable consciousness. Wolff came to Jung in her early 20s, depressed and directionless after her father's death. Jung guided her through analysis, and she experienced a profound calling, not to be his student or his mistress, though she was both, but to become a depth psychologist in her own right. What made Wolff's journey successful was her refusal to define herself through relationship to Jung. Yes, they were intimate. Yes, she was part of his life for decades. But she maintained what Jung called psychological independence. She developed her own theories. Her work on feminine typology remains influential. She saw her own patients. She claimed authority from her direct experience of the unconscious, rather than from being Jung's chosen one. Wolff experienced all the symptoms we've discussed: loss of interest in conventional partnership, calling toward solitude, direct communion with archetypal energies, but she navigated them consciously with Jung's guidance and her own fierce commitment to individuation. She never married, never had children, lived essentially alone while maintaining chosen relationships, and she became what Jung called a woman who individuated, complete unto herself, capable of conscious relationship without dependency. When she died in 1953, Jung wrote that she'd achieved what few women of her generation managed, becoming herself. Hildegard of Bingen, mystic authority through relational withdrawal. Hildegard is the historical example Jung loved citing when discussing feminine individuation. She was a 12th century Benedictine abbess who experienced mystical visions from childhood, but didn't claim her authority until midlife. At age 42, that crucial threshold Jung identified for women's spiritual awakening, Hildegard received what she described as a direct command from God to share her visions publicly. She did something radical. She withdrew from conventional relational life, refused to be defined as somebody's sister, daughter, or subordinate, claimed spiritual authority directly from her mystical experiences rather than from male religious authority. Hildegard composed music, wrote theology, practiced medicine, counseled popes and emperors, all from a position of autonomous spiritual authority. Jung recognized her as someone who completed the hieroskamos consciously. Her visions described union with divine light, sacred marriage with God, experiences Jung understood as the self merging with ego consciousness. Hildegard lived to 81, productive and powerful until the end. Her success came from what Jung called holding the tension, remaining in relationship with her community while refusing to let relationship define her. She showed that individuation doesn't require literal isolation. It requires internal sovereignty, even while maintaining external connection. Emma Jung, the individuating wife. The most instructive success story is Emma Jung, Carl's wife, who underwent her own profound individuation during their marriage. Emma started as the conventional wife, supporting Carl's career, raising their children, managing the household. But in her 40s, she began experiencing the exact symptoms we've discussed: dreams of ancient feminine figures, loss of interest in domestic rituals, a calling toward her own intellectual and spiritual development. rather than suppress it, Emma claimed it. She studied alchemy, developed her own theories about the animus and the Grail legend, and eventually published her own work. Most remarkably, she renegotiated her marriage. She didn't leave Carl, but she established what Jung called psychological distance, maintaining the relationship while refusing to let it consume her identity. Emma and Carl's marriage became a case study in conscious relationship. Two individuated beings choosing partnership while maintaining sovereignty. It wasn't always comfortable. There were years of tension, especially around Carl's relationship with Toni Wolff. But Emma's individuation transformed the marriage from unconscious fusion into conscious union. She stopped needing Carl to complete her, and paradoxically, that's what allowed her to love him more fully. Emma Jung's success demonstrates that this journey doesn't inevitably destroy relationships. It destroys unconscious relationships, but it can transform them into something more real, more conscious, more aligned with both people's souls. She died in 1955, having completed her own work and established herself as a scholar independent of her husband's shadow. The pattern. What distinguishes success from failure? Studying these contrasts, certain patterns emerge. Failures share these characteristics, navigating the transition alone without guidance, inflating into archetypal material rather than integrating it, lacking grounding practices connecting them to body and daily reality, having their experiences pathologized by those around them, unable to tolerate the death phase without acting it out literally. Successes share these characteristics, having a guide or framework, Jung for Wolff, religious structure for Hildegard, self-study for Emma, maintaining grounding even while undergoing transformation, integrating rather than identifying with archetypal content, creating symbolic expression for their experiences, completing the death-rebirth cycle consciously rather than literally. The difference isn't intelligence or strength or even suffering. The difference is consciousness. Wolff, Zelda, and Plath suffered as intensely as Wolff, Hildegard, and Emma, but they suffered unconsciously. They had no map, no framework, no one telling them that what they were experiencing was transformation rather than destruction. And that's the tragedy, because all 6 women were experiencing the same phenomenon, the soul's demand for wholeness beyond conventional feminine roles. 3 of them died. 3 of them transformed. The variable was consciousness. Jung spent his career trying to prevent unnecessary deaths, trying to give people maps so that genuine spiritual emergence wouldn't be confused with psychosis, so that the death of ego wouldn't become literal death. But he also knew that even with the map, the journey requires something most people aren't willing to give: surrender. Surrender to not knowing. Surrender to death of the old self. Surrender to becoming someone even you don't recognize yet. The women who succeeded all shared one quality. They surrendered to the process while maintaining enough ego strength to survive it. That's the razor's edge. Too much ego strength and you resist the transformation entirely. Too little and the transformation consumes you. Jung himself had to walk that edge, and his journey, his own confrontation with what this process demands, is worth examining, because even the master nearly didn't survive. We need to talk about something that gets glossed over in most discussions of Jung. He didn't develop his theories from a place of mastery. He developed them from a place of near psychotic breakdown. Between 1913 and 1919, Jung underwent what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. It's documented in his Red Book, a massive illuminated manuscript that he kept secret for decades, only allowing it to be published posthumously. What was he confronting? On the surface, it was his own psyche after his break with Freud. But on a deeper level, Jung was confronting the autonomous feminine within his own unconscious, and learning the exact lessons we've been discussing about women's individuation. Here's what mainstream Jungian psychology often fails to emphasize. Jung's breakthrough insights about feminine development came not from objective observation, but from being shattered by feminine archetypal forces in his own psyche. The Salome experience, when the feminine becomes dangerous. In one of his early active imagination experiences, documented in the Red Book, Jung encountered a figure named Salome. She appeared alongside Elijah, representing his inner wisdom, but Salome disturbed him profoundly. She was seductive, dangerous, and claimed to love him. Jung was terrified of her. He wrote, "Salome is an anima figure, but she is blind. This should be understood as meaning that she does not see the meaning of things, but is simply there, a force of nature that speaks with her whole being." What Jung was experiencing was the autonomous feminine, not as mother, not as muse, not as anything domesticated or comprehensible within his existing frameworks. Salome represented feminine power that didn't need masculine validation or direction, and Jung couldn't integrate her. In his visions, she kept insisting she loved him, and he kept refusing to believe her, because to accept her love would mean accepting that the feminine within his own psyche didn't need him, the ego, to define or control it. This is precisely what women experience when the self begins demanding primacy over relationship. The feminine principle within them rises up and says, "I don't need you, the relational persona, the good wife, the pleasing woman, to define me. I am autonomous." And the ego panics. Jung's ego panicked so severely during this period that he regularly feared he was going insane. He wrote, "I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible." He was experiencing what women going through midlife individuation experience, the complete dissolution of the old order, the old self, the old framework for understanding reality. The Emma and Toni triangle. Living his theories. Jung's personal life during this period forced him to confront his own theories about women's individuation in the most uncomfortable way possible. Emma, his wife of nearly a decade, mother of his children, began her own individuation process. She started studying independently, developing her own thoughts, claiming psychological space separate from her role as Jung's wife. Simultaneously, Toni Wolff entered his life. Toni represented something Emma couldn't, what Jung would later theorize as different archetypal feminine types. Emma was the stabilizing, grounding force. Toni was the intellectual catalyst, the spiritual provocateur. Jung's solution, maintaining relationships with both women simultaneously, scandalized Zurich society, but from a depth psychological perspective, he was living out the exact pattern he was beginning to understand. That women's wholeness requires aspects the collective doesn't permit within conventional partnership. Here's what's crucial. Both women were individuating beyond their roles in relation to him. Emma refused to be merely the wife. Toni refused to be merely the mistress or the student. And Jung struggled profoundly with this. His private writings from this period show a man completely disoriented by women claiming autonomy. He wanted to be the center of their psychological universes. He wanted them to need him for their sense of identity and purpose. But both women were undergoing the exact transformation we've been discussing. Both were experiencing the self-demanding primacy over relationship. And Jung, brilliant as he was, had to watch his own theories destroy his fantasies about what women should be. The Red Book Revelations, Feminine Wisdom Beyond Comprehension. As Jung went deeper into his confrontation with the unconscious, he encountered more feminine figures, the soul, the anima in various forms, ancient goddesses, and what he called she who is. These figures consistently delivered the same message. The feminine principle seeks wholeness beyond relationship. The feminine contains its own masculine. The feminine doesn't need external union to be complete. This revelation terrified and humbled Jung, because it meant that his entire framework for understanding women's psychology, based on the assumption that women naturally sought completion through union with men, was incomplete. In one Red Book passage, a feminine figure tells him, "You men believe we need you to be whole, but we are already whole. What we need is permission to remember." Jung wrote beside this passage, "This thought is almost unbearable." Why unbearable? Because it meant that even the most conscious, individuated man could never complete a woman. At best, he could witness and honor her wholeness. At worst, he could obstruct it. This is what modern women experiencing relational outgrowing need to understand. Even Jung, the man who developed the psychological framework for this entire phenomenon, struggled to accept it when confronted with it directly. Your partner's confusion, resistance, or feelings of inadequacy when you undergo this transformation aren't personal failures. They're encountering the same reality Jung encountered, that women's souls have trajectories that don't revolve around men, the near-psychotic episodes when the ego can't contain the self. Jung's Red Book period included several episodes where he nearly lost his grip on consensus reality. He would have visions in broad daylight. He would hear voices that seemed as real as external speech. He would lose track of time, forget where he was, experience what he described as being seized by the unconscious. This is what happens when the self emerges too rapidly, too intensely, without adequate integration. Jung had developed enough ego strength through his career to barely maintain functionality. He continued seeing patients, maintained his family responsibilities, kept one foot in ordinary reality even while the other foot was in the abyss. But it was close, so close that he later wrote, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications." He also wrote, "I was frequently so wrought up that I had to do certain yoga exercises in order to hold my emotions in check. But since it was my purpose to know what was going on within myself, I would do these exercises only until I had calmed myself enough to resume my work with the unconscious." This is crucial practical guidance from Jung's own experience. You need grounding practices. You need ways to return to your body, to consensus reality, to ordinary life. Without them, the unconscious will devour you. Jung practiced yoga, took long walks, maintained his clinical work, forced himself to engage with his family even when he wanted to disappear entirely into the visions. This is the model for women going through this transition. You need one foot in ordinary reality even while the other explores the depths. The transformation, what Jung learned from surviving. When Jung emerged from his Red Book period, he was fundamentally changed, not just in his theories, but in his being. He'd learned several crucial lessons that informed his work with women for the rest of his career. First, the feminine psyche has its own teleology, its own purpose and direction, that doesn't require masculine completion. This was revolutionary for a man raised in Victorian patriarchy. Second, women's spirituality often requires withdrawal from relationship to access depths that relationship obscures. He stopped pathologizing women who needed solitude. Third, the anima, his term for the feminine in men's psychology, isn't a projection onto women but an autonomous psychological reality within every individual psyche. Men need to integrate their own feminine. Women need to integrate their own masculine. External relationship is optional, not essential. Fourth, the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, is primarily an internal event. External relationship can reflect it, but cannot substitute for it. Fifth, individuation requires death, not metaphorical death, actual death of who you thought you were. And most people will not tolerate this death, which is why most people never individuate. Jung's humility after this period is striking. He stopped claiming to fully understand women's psychology. He acknowledged that much of feminine experience remained mysterious to him because he experienced it through the lens of masculine consciousness. In his later seminars, he would often defer to his female colleagues, Marie-Louise von France, Barbara Hanna, Jolande Jacobi, when discussing women's individuation. He'd learned that witnessing his own inner feminine was different from understanding actual women's experiences. This is important for women navigating this transition. Even the expert can't fully map your journey. Only you can. Your job is to develop the consciousness to navigate it yourself, not to find someone who will do it for you. The legacy, Jung's gift to women. Experiencing this, what Jung gave to women undergoing this transformation wasn't answers. It was a framework. He normalized the symptoms. He gave them archetypal context. He assured them they weren't crazy, they were transforming. He developed practical tools, active imagination, shadow work, animus integration that actually worked. And he validated something crucial, that women's highest spiritual development might look nothing like the collective story about women's fulfillment. But Jung also left limitations. His theories were still shaped by his time, his culture, his gender. He never fully understood what it felt like to be a woman, told her entire value comes from relationship, attempting to individuate beyond that programming. He understood it intellectually. He witnessed it, but he didn't live it. That's why women's own voices, their case studies, their journals, their art from the midst of this transition are so crucial. They fill in what Jung couldn't. The warning, Jung's final thoughts on this late in his life. Jung gave a seminar where he spoke directly about women's midlife individuation. He said something that never made it into his published works, but was recorded in seminar notes. The woman who individuates beyond relationship becomes either very dangerous or very holy. Dangerous if she inflates, believing herself superior to those still caught in collective patterns. Holy if she completes the work and returns to offer what she's learned. The collective will crucify the dangerous woman and ignore the holy one, because both threaten the order that keeps women contained within relational service. My hope is that someday enough women will complete this journey that the collective story itself changes, that women's wholeness beyond partnership becomes the norm rather than the exception. But we are not there yet, and until we are, each woman who undergoes this dies alone, even if surrounded by people, dies to the collective story, dies to who she was taught to be. I can give you a map. I cannot walk the path for you, and I cannot promise that those who love you will understand. This is Jung's final gift to women experiencing this. Radical honesty. He won't promise your relationship will survive. He won't promise your family will support you. He won't promise anything except that if you do this work consciously, you will become real. And real is worth everything. But you have to decide if you agree, because what comes next are the actual tools, the daily practices that make conscious individuation possible, and tools only work for people willing to use them. Theory is useless without practice. Jung knew this. He spent decades refining techniques that actually worked, not in the abstract, but in lived experience. These aren't spiritual bypasses. These are grounded psychological practices that create the container necessary for conscious transformation. Fair warning, these practices require time, solitude, and consistency. If you're not willing to give them at least 20 minutes daily, don't start. Dabbling in this work is more dangerous than not doing it at all. Practice 1. Morning Shadow Dialogue. 20 minutes daily. This is the foundation. Every other practice builds on shadow integration because you cannot individuate while projecting your disowned qualities onto others. How to do it? Wake 20 minutes earlier than usual. Before checking your phone, before engaging with anyone, sit with a journal. Write this prompt. What quality am I judging in others right now? Maybe you're judging women who are too relationship-focused. Maybe you're judging people who seem selfish or spiritual or whatever triggers you. Write the quality, then write, this quality exists in me as, and tell the truth. If you judge women who are relationship-obsessed, acknowledge where you've been desperate for validation through partnership. If you judge selfishness, acknowledge where you've wanted to prioritize yourself but haven't had the courage. Now dialogue with that quality. Give it a voice. Shadow, why do you need to speak? Let it respond. Don't edit. What gift are you trying to bring to my wholeness? Let it answer. This isn't comfortable. Your shadow will tell you things your ego doesn't want to hear. It will reveal that you're not as evolved as you thought. That's the point. Expected responses, resistance, defensiveness. I don't have that quality. This is the ego protecting itself. Push through, integration. Once you've heard the shadow's message, ask, how can I integrate you consciously? The shadow usually wants expression, not suppression. Find healthy ways to let the quality exist in your life. Do this daily for at least 30 days. Watch how your judgments of others dissolve as you integrate what you've been projecting. Practice 2. Animus Integration Ritual, 45 minutes weekly. Jung's active imagination technique applied specifically to developing conscious relationship with your inner masculine. How to do it? Set aside undisturbed time. Light a candle if that helps create ritual space. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, take several deep breaths. Speak aloud. I invite my animus to appear. I'm ready to meet you consciously. Wait. Don't force an image. He might appear as a specific person, an archetypal figure, or simply a felt presence. When you sense him, ask, who are you? What have you been trying to tell me through my attractions to men? What masculine qualities do I need to develop in myself? How can you serve my wholeness rather than being projected onto partners? Let him respond. If he's critical or harsh, that's unintegrated animus. Tell him, I hear you, but I need you as an ally, not an attacker. Can you shift? Usually, when addressed directly, the animus softens. He becomes a guide rather than a tyrant. Expected responses. Some women encounter a gentle king or wise sage immediately. Others meet a warrior or trickster. Some encounter the wounded boy who needs integration before he can help. Work with whoever appears. The animus evolves through relationship with you. Integration. After the session, write down his messages. Over time, you'll notice your animus becomes a trusted inner advisor. You'll access qualities like decisiveness, clear boundaries, and spiritual authority without needing to seek them in external men. Practice 3. Dream incubation for self-guidance, nightly practice. Jung used dreams as direct communication with the unconscious. You can invite specific guidance through dream incubation. How to do it? Before sleep, write in your dream journal, I ask the self to show me what I need to know about specific question. Examples, show me what my soul wants beyond relationship. Reveal the next step in my individuation. Help me understand this restlessness. Keep the journal beside your bed. When you wake, even at 3 a.m., record immediately. Dreams fade fast. Don't analyze yet. Just record. After a week, review your dreams. Jung taught that the unconscious answers in symbols, not literal instructions. Look for recurring images or figures' emotional tone. Are the dreams anxious or peaceful? Archetypal patterns, journey, death, rebirth, sacred spaces, direct messages from dream figures. Expected responses. Initially, you might remember nothing. That's okay. The unconscious needs to learn you're listening. Keep asking. Integration. When you receive clear symbolic messages, honor them. If you dream of a temple, research sacred space symbolism. If you dream of a wise old woman, dialogue with her in active imagination. Jung believed dreams were more honest than conscious thought. Trust them over your ego's preferences. Practice 4. The 4-square mandala practice. 15 minutes daily. Jung had patients draw mandalas, circular designs, as a way to track the ego-self axis. The mandala spontaneously reflects your psychological state. How to do it? Get a sketchbook dedicated to this. Practice. Each day draw a circle. Freehand is fine. Divide it into 4 quadrants. Without thinking, fill each quadrant with colors, symbols, words, abstract designs. Don't plan it. Let your hand move intuitively. Date each mandala. After 30 days, review them. Jung found that mandalas become more integrated, balanced, and centered as individuation progresses. Chaotic mandalas indicate psychological upheaval. Ordered mandalas indicate integration. Expected responses. I can't draw. Irrelevant. This isn't art, it's psychological diagnosis. Even stick figures and random shapes reveal unconscious content. Integration. Notice patterns. Are your mandalas always divided sharply? That might indicate unintegrated opposites. Are they always one color? That might indicate emotional stagnation. Use what you see to direct your other practices. Practice 5. Solitude as sacrament. Half-day, monthly minimum. This is non-negotiable for women individuating beyond relationship. But it must be conscious solitude, not just being alone. How to do it? Schedule a half-day, 4 hours minimum, of complete solitude. No phone, no books unless they're sacred texts, no distractions. Create ritual to mark this as sacred. Bathe beforehand. Wear specific clothing reserved for this, light incense or candles. State your intention. I enter solitude to meet myself. Then do nothing. Sit, walk slowly. Journal if moved to. Cry if it comes. Lie on the floor. Stare at trees. The point isn't productivity, it's presence. Jung called this active passivity, being receptive to whatever the unconscious wants to communicate. Expected responses. Massive resistance. Your ego will scream that this is wasted time. You'll think of 100 things you should be doing. That's the ego terrified of being irrelevant. Push through. The gifts come after the resistance. Integration. After your solitude, write, what did I encounter? Maybe nothing obvious, maybe profound peace, maybe uncomfortable emotions. Whatever arose is what needed your attention. Do this monthly minimum, weekly if possible. Jung believed that regular solitude was as essential as food for people individuating. Practice 6, relationship inventory, 1 intensive weekend. This practice involves reviewing every significant relationship to identify patterns and retrieve projections. How to do it? Set aside a weekend. Gather photos, journals, anything that evokes past relationships. Create a timeline of significant partners or attractions. For each, write, what qualities did I most admire, desire in them? What did I hope they would give me or make me feel? What was I avoiding in myself by projecting onto them? What pattern from my family of origin was I repeating? Be ruthlessly honest. This isn't about blaming them or yourself. It's about seeing the unconscious patterns. Jung found that most people repeat the same relationship dynamic endlessly, with different faces. The work is recognizing the pattern so you can choose differently. Expected responses. Grief, rage, embarrassment at how unconscious you've been. That's good. It means you're seeing clearly for the first time. Integration. After the inventory, write letters to past partners. Don't send them. Thank them for carrying your projections and teaching you what you needed to learn. Then write, I retrieve my projections. The qualities I sought in you, I now develop in myself. This is how you reclaim energy from the past. Practice 7, the Unlived Life Letter, 1 session. Jung believed that symptoms often arise from the unlived life, the paths not taken, the potential not actualized. How to do it? Write a letter from your future self, the woman you would have become if you'd followed your soul's call from the beginning. Start. Dear younger me, this is who you could have been. Let her describe what she does with her time, what relationships she has or doesn't, what she's created, how she feels in her body, what she knows. Don't edit for realism. Let her be as wild, successful, content, or unconventional as she wants. Expected responses, tears. This letter often reveals exactly what your soul wants that you've been suppressing. Integration. Read the letter regularly. Let it inform your choices. Ask, what would she do when faced with decisions? She's not fantasy. She's your unlived potential, trying to become actual. Integration across all practices. These 7 practices work together. Shadow dialogue prevents inflation. Animus work ends projections onto partners. Dream incubation gives direct self-guidance. Mandalas track your progress. Solitude provides space for transformation. Relationship inventory retrieves your energy. Unlived life letter clarifies direction. You don't need to do all of them perfectly, but you need to do some of them consistently. Jung was clear. Consciousness develops through practice, not through reading about practice. You can understand every theory in this video and still live unconsciously if you don't do the actual work. And the work is work. It's uncomfortable. It requires time you don't think you have. It asks you to face aspects of yourself you've been avoiding for decades. But it's the only way through, because the alternative, remaining unconscious while the self demands emergence, leads to the dangers we've already discussed. Inflation, psychosis, chronic suffering, living death. These practices create the container. They give the transformation a conscious structure so it doesn't destroy you. But they only work if you actually do them. Which brings us to the next section, understanding the complete arc of this transformation, because knowing where you are in the process makes the suffering bearable. It gives you a map, and maps, as Jung knew, are the difference between wandering lost and journeying with purpose. Jung understood that all meaningful transformation follows an archetypal pattern. He called it the hero's journey when writing about it generally, but for women, individuating beyond relationship, the pattern has specific stages. Knowing which stage you're in doesn't make it easier, but it makes it bearable because you can see that the current suffering has purpose and direction. Stage 1. The call refused. Duration, months to years. This is where most women spend the longest time. The symptoms appear: restlessness, dreams, loss of interest in relational rituals, but you refuse to acknowledge what they mean. You tell yourself it's stress, or hormones, or that you need to try harder at your relationship. You read self-help books about rekindling romance. You go to couples therapy focused on fixing communication. Meanwhile, the symptoms intensify. The dreams become more urgent. The body starts producing illness. The psyche escalates its messages because you're not listening. Psychological characteristics: massive guilt about your feelings, belief that something is wrong with you, attempting to fix the relationship from surface level, exhaustion from performing enthusiasm. You don't feel isolation because you can't talk about this honestly. Expected duration: this can last years. Jung found that women often refuse the call until a crisis forces the issue. Illness, partner's affair, children leaving home, death of a parent. Common pitfalls: medicating the symptoms, getting pregnant to recommit to relationship, having an affair as unconscious escape, developing psychosomatic illness that justifies withdrawal. Symbolic dreams: being trapped in small spaces, missing trains or flights, searching for something lost, being chased or pursued. How to support yourself. Start journaling honestly. Begin therapy with someone trained in depth psychology. Read Jung. Let yourself acknowledge, even privately, that something real is happening. Stage 2. Threshold crossing. Duration 6-18 months. Something happens that makes refusal impossible. Maybe you have a dream so powerful you can't dismiss it. Maybe your body breaks down completely. Maybe you have an affair or a sudden spiritual experience that cracks open your denial. Whatever the trigger, you cross the threshold. You acknowledge, something has to change. I can't keep living like this. This is terrifying because you don't know what change means yet. You just know the old way is dying. Psychological characteristics. First acts of claiming space-time for yourself. Setting boundaries that feel selfish. Telling partner, family, I'm going through something. Facing their confusion, hurt, anger. Massive fear of what you're unleashing. Expected duration. The crossing itself can be sudden, but integrating what it means takes 6-18 months. Common pitfalls. Making impulsive, huge changes. Quitting job, ending relationship immediately. Expecting others to understand or support you. Believing that crossing the threshold means the hard part is over. Symbolic dreams. Entering dark forests, descending stairs or caves, meeting mysterious guides, death of loved ones, symbolizing death of old self. How to support yourself. This is when you need the practices most. Start daily shadow work. Find a Jung-trained analyst if possible. Create rituals that mark this transition as sacred rather than shameful. Real-life signs. You cancel social obligations without guilt. You say no to things you've always said yes to. You stop performing happiness in your relationship. You claim physical space, maybe a room of your own, regular time alone. Your family will react. Partners often panic, thinking you're leaving or having an affair. Children sense the shift and may act out. Friends may distance themselves. Jung called this the ordeal of isolation. The collective withdraws support when you step outside prescribed roles. You have to learn to bear this isolation without collapsing back into old patterns. Stage 3. The abyss. Duration 1-3 years. This is the hardest stage. Jung called it the dark night of the soul. Everything you knew about yourself dissolves. The old identity is dead, but the new one hasn't emerged yet. You're in pure void, pure not knowing. Psychological characteristics, complete disorientation about who you are, inability to return to old ways but no clear path forward, feeling like you're going crazy, questioning everything you've ever believed, profound loneliness, no one understands, simultaneous terror, and strange peace. Expected duration. Jung found this stage lasted 1-3 years for most women. It cannot be rushed. The psyche is doing deep reconstruction work that doesn't operate on ego's timeline. Common pitfalls, giving up and collapsing back into old identity, spiritual bypassing, using practices to avoid the actual pain, dangerous inflation or withdrawal, acting out through affairs, substance use, reckless behavior, suicidal ideation when the void feels unbearable, symbolic dreams, dying, being in vast, empty landscapes, wandering lost, drowning, being dismembered, classic shamanic initiation imagery, apocalyptic scenes, stark black and white imagery, physical symptoms, chronic fatigue, autoimmune flares, depression that doesn't respond to medication, complete loss of libido, feeling literally disconnected from your body. How to support yourself? This is where Jung's grounding practices become life-saving. You need daily embodiment, walk, yoga, garden, anything physical. One person who can witness without trying to fix, strict boundaries around who gets access to you. Permission to be completely non-functional some days. Creative expression, paint, write, move, externalize what's happening. Jung emphasized, do not make major life decisions during this stage. Don't blow everything up just because you're in chaos. The chaos is the process. What's actually happening? Your ego is dissolving its identification with persona. The self is reorganizing your entire psychological structure. This is necessary, this is healthy, but it feels like death because it is death of who you thought you were. Signs you're moving through rather than stuck. Moments of unexpected peace in the midst of chaos. Dreams showing transformation imagery, butterflies, snakes shedding skin, phoenixes, spontaneous creative expression, less fear even though nothing external has improved. Ability to tolerate not knowing signs you're stuck and need intervention. Suicidal ideation that feels like actual desire to die, not symbolic death. Complete inability to function for extended periods. Psychotic symptoms. Hallucinations, delusions, loss of reality testing. Dangerous acting out physical health crisis. If stuck, you need professional help immediately. Jung-trained analyst, transpersonal therapist, or at minimum, a psychiatrist who understands spiritual emergency. Stage 4. Sacred marriage. Duration 6-12 months. Something shifts. Maybe gradually, maybe suddenly. You experience what Jung called the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage within. You're no longer seeking. You're no longer incomplete. You feel, for the first time, whole. Psychological characteristics. Profound internal peace. No longer needing external validation. Experiencing yourself as both masculine and feminine. Direct knowing rather than seeking knowledge. Compassion for your previous struggles without attachment to them. Natural authority that doesn't require defense. Expected duration. The initial experience can be momentary, a vision, a dream, a meditation breakthrough, but integrating it takes 6 to 12 months. Common pitfalls: inflation, believing you're enlightened. Premature return to old life before integration is complete. Using this experience to justify superiority over others still struggling. Symbolic dreams. Sacred sexuality, marriage ceremonies, mandalas, unified images. Hermaphrodites, divine couples in union, light imagery, temples, crystalline structures, physical changes, energy returns but different quality, stable rather than manic, grounded rather than scattered. Libido might return but redirected toward creativity, spirituality, life itself rather than specific people. How to support yourself. This is when you integrate everything you've learned. Keep practicing. Don't abandon what got you here. Use this stage to establish new life structures that honor your wholeness. What's actually happening? The ego has established conscious relationship with the self. You're no longer identified with persona, but with something essential. You've completed the internal marriage Jung spent his career mapping. Real-life signs. Making decisions from internal authority. Decreased reactivity to others' opinions, ability to be alone without loneliness, simultaneous capacity for solitude and intimacy, creative work flowing naturally, physical health, improving dreams, becoming more peaceful, integrative about relationships at this stage. Some women realize their current relationship can transform into conscious partnership. The partner has also grown, developed his own wholeness. They meet as two complete beings. Others realize the relationship was based entirely on unconscious fusion and cannot evolve. Ending it becomes clear, sad, but necessary. Still others choose conscious solitude, discovering that partnering isn't essential to their particular path. Jung never prescribed one outcome. The question is only, what choice honors your wholeness? Stage 5. Return with elixir, duration, ongoing. In the hero's journey, the hero returns to the ordinary world, carrying gifts for the community. Same here. You don't stay in the sacred marriage state as peak experience. You return to ordinary life, but utterly changed. You bring what you've learned, psychological characteristics, living from self rather than ego as default, paradoxical combination of humility and authority, becoming elder regardless of age, capacity to hold space for others' transformations, no need to prove or defend your path. Grounded spirituality, mystical and practical. Expected duration. This is the rest of your life. Individuation isn't a destination, it's a way of being. Common pitfalls, complacency, thinking the work is done, losing grounding, getting too ethereal, martyrdom, sacrificing yourself to help others instead of maintaining boundaries. Symbolic dreams, teaching, guiding others, building or creating structures, harmonious landscapes, completion imagery, how to support yourself, maintain your practices, continue analysis or spiritual direction, find community with others on this path, share what you've learned without missionary zeal, what you offer the world, evidence that this transformation is possible. Witness for women beginning the journey, wisdom from having survived capacity to hold paradox, that others find unbearable connection to archetypal energies that serve collective evolution. Jung called women at this stage culture bearers. They hold consciousness in a culture that prefers unconsciousness. They demonstrate alternative ways of being that threaten and inspire simultaneously. About relationships at this stage. If you're partnered, the relationship is fundamentally different from what you started with. It's conscious, chosen daily, based on two complete people rather than two halves seeking wholeness. If you're alone, you're not lonely, you're sovereign. You might choose partnership later from this place, or you might not. Both are fine. The key is, relationship is no longer the center. The self is the center. Everything else, including relationship, orbits around that center. Physical embodiment. You finally feel at home in your body. The split between psyche and soma heals. Your sexuality, creativity, and spirituality aren't separate. They're integrated expressions of wholeness. Creative expression. Many women at this stage become artists, writers, teachers, therapists, or leaders in some form, not for ego recognition but because the self demands expression. Jung called this objective work, creating from the unconscious rather than from personal ambition. Relationship to younger women. You become the wise woman figure that appeared in your own dreams during stage 3. Not because you seek the role, but because women in earlier stages recognize something in you. They see evidence that the journey is survivable. Jung emphasized, don't proselytize. Don't try to convince anyone this path is right for them. Simply live it. The women who need to find you will find you through synchronicity. Ongoing challenges. Individuation doesn't mean perfection. You'll still have difficult days, relationships will still challenge you, shadow material will still arise. The difference is you have tools, consciousness, and trust in the process. Non-linear reality, cycling through stages. Jung warned against thinking these stages are linear. You don't complete one and move to the next permanently. Women often cycle through them at deeper levels. You might experience the hieroskamos in stage 4, integrate it, then years later descend back into an abyss as the psyche prepares you for another level of wholeness. Each cycle goes deeper. Each time through the stages you integrate more, release more, become more essentially yourself. Signs you're cycling rather than regressing. The challenges feel familiar, but you're meeting them with more consciousness. The abyss is still dark, but you trust the process now. Shadow material that arises is subtler, more nuanced. Physical symptoms are messages rather than emergencies. You can hold paradox without needing resolution. Signs you're actually regressing. Complete loss of consciousness you've gained. repeating exact same patterns unconsciously, using spiritual language to justify unconscious behavior, inflating into believing you're beyond these stages. The difference is consciousness. Are you aware of where you are and choosing your responses? Or have you fallen back into unconscious reactivity? Timeline flexibility. Your journey is unique. Jung gave general time frames, but he emphasized your psyche has its own timing. Some women move through all 5 stages in 2 years, others take a decade. Variables that affect timing, constitutional strength, your baseline psychological resilience, support systems, therapy, community, financial stability, life circumstances, children, career demands, health depth of unconsciousness, how identified you were with relational persona, spiritual preparation, prior meditation, therapy, or inner work. Archetypal calling. Some women are called to rapid transformation, others to gradual. Don't compare your timeline to anyone else's. Don't let anyone tell you you're going too slow or too fast. Jung's only criterion, are you becoming more conscious? Then you're on track. Recognizing where you are right now. Read back through the 5 stages. Which one resonates most strongly with your current experience? If you're not sure, look at your dreams from the past month. The unconscious will show you through symbol where you are. Refusal dreams, trapped, searching, missing opportunities, threshold dreams, entering, dark spaces, meeting guides, abyss dreams, death, dissolution, vast emptiness, sacred marriage dreams, union, light, mandalas, wholeness, return dreams, teaching, building, harmony. Once you identify your stage, you can apply the appropriate practices and avoid the specific pitfalls. But here's what's crucial. Wherever you are is exactly where you need to be. The psyche doesn't make mistakes. If you're in the abyss, it's because something in you needs the abyss. Trust the process. Jung's final word on the transformation arc. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But the price of that privilege is everything you thought you were. You're paying that price right now. The question is only whether you're paying it consciously, with awareness, tools, and community, or unconsciously, through suffering that has no meaning. This video is trying to give you the consciousness, but consciousness alone isn't enough. You also need to know the specific traps that can derail you even when you're doing the work. Because there are pitfalls that catch even conscious seekers, subtle ways this sacred journey gets corrupted, and that's what we need to examine next. Jung learned something crucial through decades of practice. Knowing the path doesn't protect you from its traps. Even conscious seekers fall into predictable patterns that corrupt genuine individuation. These aren't moral failures. They're psychological traps built into the process itself. But awareness of them creates the possibility of avoiding them, or at least catching yourself quickly when you fall in. Pitfall 1. Spiritual inflation, mistaking ego. Awakening for self-realization. This is the most common trap and the hardest to recognize from inside. You begin experiencing the symptoms of individuation, synchronicities, profound dreams, mystical states, clarity about your path. And instead of recognizing these as gifts from the self, your ego identifies with them. You start believing, I'm more conscious than others. I've transcended relationship while they're still trapped in codependency. I'm ascending while they're stuck in 3D reality. How it manifests. You develop contempt for women still invested in partnership. You speak about your journey in ways that subtly or overtly position you as more evolved. You surround yourself with spiritual language that justifies looking down on unconscious people. You might start a blog or social media presence where you teach about toxic relationships and choosing yourself, not from compassion but from superiority. You collect followers who reflect your inflation back to you. You interpret every synchronicity as evidence of your special spiritual status. You believe the universe is personally invested in your journey because you're important to collective evolution. Jung called this identification with the archetype. You're no longer experiencing the self. You've become identified with it, believing the consciousness flowing through you originates from your ego. Warning signs: feeling superior to people in relationships, using Jungian or spiritual language to establish hierarchy, intolerance for others' unconsciousness, belief that you're uniquely gifted or chosen, inability to laugh at yourself, defensiveness when challenged, surrounding yourself with people who only affirm your specialness. Why it's dangerous. Inflation is a defense against the vulnerability of genuine transformation. If you're special, you don't have to feel the terror of dying to your old self. If you're superior, you don't have to grieve what you've lost. But inflation blocks further individuation. You're stuck in an inflated ego rather than dissolved into the self. And it makes you insufferable. You lose friends, alienate family, and create an echo chamber where no genuine growth can occur. The antidote: ruthless humility. Find people who will call you on your inflation. A good therapist, an honest friend, a spiritual director who doesn't indulge grandiosity. Ask yourself daily, is my transformation making me kinder or more judgmental, more able to hold paradox or more certain I'm right, more human or more superior? Jung's test. The individuated person becomes more ordinary, not more special. They can finally be simply human. If your journey is making you feel extraordinary, you're inflating. If it's making you feel grateful to be an ordinary human, capable of wholeness, you're individuating. Pitfall 2. Withdrawal into schizoid defense, confusing sovereignty with isolation. This trap looks like individuation but is actually its opposite, using spiritual language to justify pathological withdrawal from human connection. You claim you are choosing yourself and honoring your boundaries, but underneath you're terrified of vulnerability. You're using individuation as sophisticated armor against being seen, being hurt, being human. How it manifests: you cut off relationships that challenge you, calling it releasing toxic people. You refuse all emotional vulnerability, calling it maintaining sovereignty. You live in complete isolation, calling it sacred solitude. You develop a philosophy that relationships are inherently compromising to your wholeness. You believe that needing anything from anyone is weakness. You pride yourself on being completely self-sufficient. Your individuation looks like no deep friendships, no intimate partnerships, no community involvement, no one who really knows you. The distinction Jung made: sacred solitude increases your capacity for genuine intimacy. It prepares you for conscious relationship. You withdraw temporarily to integrate, then return to connection from wholeness. Schizoid withdrawal decreases your capacity for intimacy. It's a defense mechanism developed to avoid the pain of connection. You withdraw permanently because you're afraid. Warning signs: years passing without any intimate connection, unable to be vulnerable with anyone, using spiritual language to justify emotional unavailability, contempt for people's emotional needs, including your own, belief that self-sufficiency is the goal, absence of anyone who could challenge your perspective, loneliness you call enlightenment. Why it's dangerous. Jung believed individuation required witnesses. You can't become whole in complete isolation because part of wholeness is learning to maintain yourself while in relationship. The woman withdrawing into schizoid defense looks individuated but is actually fragmented. She's split off her need for connection and denied its existence. And the body knows. Schizoid defense often produces autoimmune disease, the body attacking itself, chronic pain, embodied loneliness, and profound depression that no amount of spiritual practice can touch. The antidote: risk. Conscious, boundaried risk. Find one person, therapist, spiritual director, friend, and practice being genuinely seen. Not your curated spiritual persona, your actual struggles, fears, needs. Jung's practice. Tell someone something you're ashamed of, something you've been hiding. Let them see it and still care about you. This is terrifying for the schizoid defense, but it's essential. Wholeness includes your need for connection. Denying that need is fragmentation disguised as transcendence. Ask yourself, is my solitude preparing me for deeper connection, or is it protecting me from ever being vulnerable again? If you're using individuation language to avoid intimacy, you're in the schizoid trap. Pitfall 3, the martyrdom complex. Broadcasting suffering for spiritual currency. This trap is subtle because it looks like authenticity. You're openly sharing your journey, your pain, your transformation, but underneath you're using your suffering for unconscious gain. How it manifests. You make your individuation journey your identity. Every conversation becomes about your spiritual growth. Your social media is constant updates about your struggles, your breakthroughs, your downloads from the universe. You position yourself as the wounded healer before you've actually healed. You start teaching, coaching, or guiding others through this process while you're still in stage 3, the abyss, yourself. You develop an audience that relates to you through your suffering, and unconsciously, you need to keep suffering to maintain their attention and your identity as the woman going through the transformation. The distinction Jung made: sharing your journey after integration can serve others. It provides evidence that transformation is possible. This is stage 5, return with elixir. Broadcasting your journey during the acute crisis serves your ego's need for attention, validation, and significance. This is stage 3, using your abyss as performance. Warning signs: identity built around being in transformation, need for others to witness your suffering, teaching or coaching before you've completed the journey, measuring your value by how many people you've helped. Subtle competition about whose transformation is more intense, resistance to actually completing the process, because then what would define you? Using spiritual language but still seeking external validation constantly. Why it's dangerous. The martyrdom complex keeps you stuck in suffering because suffering has become your source of meaning and attention. You're unconsciously invested in not completing the individuation because you don't know who you'd be without the drama of transformation. And you potentially harm others by modeling unintegrated process as wisdom. People in stage 2 or 3 need guidance from someone in stage 5, not commiseration from someone equally lost. The antidote: go silent. Take your journey offline. Stop broadcasting every insight and struggle. Jung was adamant about this. Real transformation happens in silence. The need to constantly share it is ego grasping for significance. Ask yourself, if no one ever knew about my journey, would I still do the work? If the answer is no, if you need the audience, the validation, the identity of transforming woman, you're in the martyrdom trap. Real individuation makes you irrelevant to yourself. You're not the hero of some grand spiritual narrative. You're just becoming who you actually are, which is actually quite ordinary. Pitfall 4. Premature return, collapsing back before integration completes. This is the trap of giving up right before breakthrough. The abyss becomes unbearable. The loneliness, the fear, the not knowing feels like it will never end. And you collapse back into old patterns before the transformation completes. How it manifests: you've been doing the work. Maybe you've even experienced glimpses of the sacred marriage. But then something happens, a moment of crisis, intense loneliness, or social pressure, and you abandon the process. You go back to trying to make the relationship work through willpower, You suppress the symptoms. You convince yourself you were being selfish or dramatic. You recommit to the relational persona because the alternative is too difficult. Jung's observation: most people turn back at the darkest hour. They enter the abyss, experience the death of ego, and right before resurrection, they panic and try to resuscitate the corpse of their old self. He called this the failure to die completely. You die 80%, but you can't tolerate the final 20%. So you remain partially dead, a zombie self, going through the motions but not truly alive. Warning signs: sudden recommitment to relationship. Working on it after months of knowing something fundamental had to change. Suppressing symptoms through increased medication, busyness, or substances. Abandoning your practices because I'm feeling better. Returning to old social circles that reinforce your relational persona. Convincing yourself the whole thing was a phase or hormonal imbalance. Feeling relief followed by deep depression. Why it's dangerous. The premature return creates what Jung called living death. You're physically present but spiritually gone. You've glimpsed your potential wholeness, then betrayed it to maintain external stability. This betrayal of self produces chronic resentment toward partner and children, life complete loss of vitality, psychosomatic illness that forces what you wouldn't choose, decades of low-grade depression, deep regret in old age. And here's the cruel truth. Once you've begun this journey, you can't truly go back. You can suppress it, but it doesn't disappear. It festers. The antidote: stay. Just stay. When the abyss feels unbearable, don't act. Don't make any decisions. Just stay present with the difficulty. Jung's advice: the only way out is through. If you turn back, you'll have to do it all again someday, probably under worse circumstances. Get support. Increase your therapy sessions. Reach out to someone further along the path. Read accounts of women who completed the journey. But don't collapse back into old patterns because you can't tolerate temporary discomfort. The death you're avoiding is the death you need. Ask yourself, what am I really afraid of? Usually, being alone forever, financial instability, social judgment, disappointing others, becoming someone unrecognizable. All valid fears, but are they worse than living the rest of your life as a ghost? How to recognize which trap you're in. You might be in multiple traps simultaneously. That's normal. The key is awareness. Quick diagnostic. If you feel superior to others, inflation. If you feel incapable of intimacy, schizoid defense. If you need others to witness your suffering, martyrdom complex. If you're about to give up, premature return, Jung's universal antidote for all traps. Find someone further along the path who will be ruthlessly honest with you, not someone who affirms everything you say. Someone who loves you enough to call you on your unconsciousness. And listen when they do. These pitfalls aren't signs of failure. They're built into the individuation process. Every person who has successfully completed this journey fell into multiple traps along the way. The difference between those who made it and those who didn't. Willingness to be corrected. Humility to recognize when you're off track. And courage to keep going even when you keep stumbling. Jung never promised this would be elegant. He promised it would be real. And real means messy, means falling down repeatedly, means getting caught in traps and having to claw your way out. But on the other side, wholeness, authenticity, a life that is genuinely yours. And to show you what that actually looks like, we need to return to a story. The woman who started this journey in chaos and emerged transformed. Because success isn't just theory, it's lived experience. Remember Maria, the woman from Section 3 who walked into Jung's office in 1921, saying, "I think I'm disappearing. Let me tell you what happened 5 years later." Jung's case notes from 1926 document Maria's return, not to his office as a patient, but to his seminar as a colleague. She'd completed her analysis, integrated her transformation, and begun working with women undergoing similar transitions. But the journey between those 2 points wasn't linear or comfortable or anything resembling the tidy transformation arc we might want. Maria's story is important because it's real. It includes the failures, the backsliding, the moments she almost gave up. And it shows what's possible when you keep going anyway. Years 1 to 2, The Descent, 1921-1923. After her initial sessions with Jung, Maria made the decision we discussed earlier. She moved into a separate apartment, not to leave her husband entirely, but to create the space her psyche was demanding. Her husband, Thomas, reacted exactly as you'd expect: confusion, hurt, anger. He told their social circle that Maria was having a breakdown. He consulted doctors about having her committed. Their children, especially her daughter, felt abandoned. The carefully constructed family structure was imploding, and Maria was the destroyer. Jung's notes from this period document Maria's crushing guilt. She would come to sessions sobbing, questioning whether she was selfish, whether she was destroying her family for nothing, whether she should just go back and force herself to make it work. But every time she considered returning prematurely, her body would respond. Migraines, insomnia. One time, a panic attack so severe she thought she was dying. The body knew, the psyche knew. Going back meant death, so she stayed in the abyss, lived alone in her small apartment, saw her children on weekends, maintained the legal marriage while living separately, and she did the work: daily active imagination, shadow integration, animist dialogue, all the practices Jung prescribed. Her dreams during this period were violent. She documented them herself. Dreams of being dismembered, drowned, burned alive. Classic shamanic death imagery. Jung told her, "Your old self is dying. These dreams are showing you the necessary violence of that death. Don't be afraid of them. Be afraid if they stop, because that would mean the psyche has given up on your transformation." Year 3, The Breakthrough, 1924. Something shifted. Maria couldn't point to a specific moment, but Jung's notes document it clearly. Her dreams changed. Instead of death imagery, she began dreaming of light, of temples, of a feminine figure she called the woman who knows. In one pivotal dream, this figure led Maria to a mirror and said, "Look, you are already whole." Maria woke from that dream weeping, but different tears, not grief, recognition. The next session with Jung, she described an experience she'd had during meditation. "I felt myself split open, but instead of breaking apart, I found that what split open was a shell, and inside was me. Actually, me. The me I've been seeking my whole life was inside the whole time." Jung recognized this immediately, the hieros, the sacred marriage. Maria had experienced the internal union that he'd been guiding her toward for 3 years. But here's what's important. This didn't solve all her problems. It didn't make her life suddenly easy or clear. It shifted her center. She was no longer seeking. She was no longer incomplete. That's all, but that's everything. Year 4, The Test, 1925. After her breakthrough, Thomas reached out. He'd done his own work, therapy with a colleague of Jung's, forced to develop capacities he'd always relied on Maria to provide. He wrote asking if they could try again. Maria's response is documented in her journal, which Jung later referenced in his seminars. "I realized I could say yes or no, and either choice would be fine. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't choosing from need or fear or duty. I was choosing from wholeness." She chose to try, but she was clear. "I'm not returning as your wife in the old sense. I'm returning as myself, choosing partnership with you if we can both maintain our sovereignty. If we can't, I'll leave again without guilt." They reunited, but the relationship was unrecognizable from what it had been. They maintained separate bedrooms. Maria kept her apartment for 6 months as insurance. She had non-negotiable days each week where she was unavailable to family, time for her practices, her work, her solitude. Thomas struggled with this. His ego wanted the old Maria back, the woman who made him the center of her world. But his soul knew that woman was gone forever. They went through cycles of connection and distance, harmony and conflict. But the quality was different. Both were conscious. Both were working with their patterns rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. Jung's notes describe this as the difficult work of conscious relationship. Two individuated beings learning to maintain their wholeness while in partnership. Year 5, The Return, 1926. By 1926, Maria had established a new life. She'd trained with Jung and begun seeing her own patients, women going through similar transitions. She'd published a paper on feminine psychology under a pseudonym. She'd created art, paintings that documented her journey in symbol and archetype. Her marriage to Thomas survived, but it looked nothing like their original relationship. They were partners but not fused, intimate but not enmeshed. They had dinner parties where they each engaged with guests as individuals rather than performing as the couple. Their children, now older, slowly came to respect what their mother had done. The daughter especially. Maria wrote, "My daughter told me yesterday that watching my transformation gave her permission to imagine her life differently. That alone makes every difficult moment worth it." When Maria appeared at Jung's seminar in 1926, he introduced her by saying, "This is what successful individuation looks like. Not perfect, not easy, but real." Maria shared her story with the other analysts. In training, she described the guilt, the terror, the abyss, but she also described something else, a quality Jung called authentic presence. She said, "I don't know if I'm happy in the way I once imagined happiness, but I'm real, I'm whole. I wake up every morning as myself rather than as who someone needs me to be. And that gift is worth everything I sacrificed." The decades that followed. Jung lost touch with Maria after she moved to Vienna in 1929, but he heard about her through colleagues. She continued working with women undergoing midlife transitions until her death in 1958. She and Thomas remained married until his death in 1947. Their relationship became a model for what Jung called psychological marriage, partnership between two sovereign individuals. Maria never claimed to be exceptional. She regularly told her patients, "I'm not special. I just refused to betray what my soul demanded, even when that meant betraying collective expectations. Anyone can do this, most won't, but anyone can." What Maria's story teaches us: her resolution wasn't a fairy tale. It was 5 years of difficult, consistent work. A relationship that survived but transformed completely. Willingness to risk everything with no guarantee of outcome. Acceptance that some people would never understand. Creation of a new life from wholeness rather than need. Maria's redemption wasn't external validation. She never became famous, never got public recognition, never had a best-selling book about her journey. Her redemption was internal. She became who she actually was. And from that wholeness, she could offer something genuine to the world. The quality that made success possible. Looking back through Jung's notes on Maria's case, one quality stands out: persistence without rigidity. She persisted through the darkest periods, didn't give up, didn't collapse back prematurely, but she also remained flexible, didn't cling to ideas about how it should look, didn't force outcomes. When the psyche said, "Stay in the abyss longer," she stayed. When it said, "Risk trying again with Thomas," she risked. When it said, "Your work is with other women," she followed. Jung called this fidelity to the self, not to the ego's preferences or the collective's expectations, to the self's trajectory. And that fidelity required Maria to develop something essential: trust. Trust that the suffering had purpose. Trust that the death would lead to rebirth. Trust that her soul knew what it was doing, even when her ego was terrified. Jung observed that women who completed this journey all shared that quality: not certainty, not confidence, trust. Trust that allowing themselves to disappear would ultimately reveal who they truly were. Maria's final message. In one of her last letters to Jung, written in the 1950s, Maria reflected on her journey. "I spent the first 40 years of my life becoming who others needed me to be, the next 5 years dying to all of that, and the decades since discovering what it means to be simply, authentically myself. I don't regret the first 40 years. They taught me everything I needed to learn before I could individuate. But I'm grateful I found the courage for the next 5, because they gave me the last 30 years of actually living rather than performing life. If I could tell women one thing, it would be this: the soul's call feels like destruction because it is destruction of everything false. But on the other side of that destruction is you, actually you, and she is worth dying for." Jung kept that letter until his own death. He sometimes read it to analysans who were in their own stage 3, the abyss, and considering giving up, because Maria's story does what theory cannot. It proves that conscious suffering leads somewhere real. That transformation isn't just possible, it's actual. That women can outgrow the container of relationship and not only survive but become more fully alive than they ever imagined. But here's the question we still need to address: why does this matter beyond the individual woman experiencing it? Why should anyone care that women are individuating beyond relationship? What does this mean for collective evolution? Because Jung believed this wasn't just personal development, it was evolutionary necessity. And that's what we need to explore next. Jung didn't see individuation as self-improvement. He saw it as evolutionary work. Each person who becomes conscious, he believed, contributes to the consciousness of the species. But women's individuation, specifically women individuating beyond relationship, carries particular significance for collective evolution, because it challenges the foundational structure on which patriarchal civilization has been built. Let me show you why this matters beyond the personal. The collective shadow of feminine dependency. For millennia, civilization has organized itself around a fundamental lie: that women are incomplete without men, that women's value comes from relationship, that women exist to serve as emotional containers for masculine development. This isn't just oppression, it's collective shadow, a shared unconscious agreement that keeps everyone trapped in limited versions of themselves. Men trapped in the burden of having to complete women, to provide their partner's meaning and identity. Women trapped in the belief that their wholeness must come through another rather than from within. And both trapped in relationships built on unconscious dependency rather than conscious choice. Jung understood that individual shadow integration affects the collective unconscious. When enough individuals integrate what the collective has repressed, the collective itself begins to shift. So when women begin integrating their capacity for wholeness beyond relationship, they're not just healing themselves, they're healing a collective wound that has shaped civilization for thousands of years. What women's autonomous wholeness threatens. Let's be direct about why this phenomenon has been suppressed. An economic system built on women's unpaid emotional labor collapses when women withdraw that labor to invest in their own wholeness. Religious structures built on women's subordination to masculine authority crumble when women claim direct access to the divine. Social hierarchies maintained through women's competition for male validation dissolve when women no longer need that validation for their sense of worth. Political systems dependent on keeping women distracted by romantic drama and domestic responsibilities shake when women redirect their energy toward consciousness, creativity, and collective transformation. This isn't conspiracy, it's structural reality. The world as currently organized requires women to remain fragmented, dependent, and convinced that their completion comes through relationship. Women who discover their own wholeness are ungovernable, not because they're rebellious, because they're no longer motivated by the rewards and punishments that keep dependent people compliant. The feminine principle beyond partnership. Jung developed his theory of the feminine principle, the receptive, intuitive, containing, transformative aspect of psyche, but he struggled to articulate its highest expression. He often described the feminine as relational, as finding meaning through connection. And that's partially true, but it's incomplete. What Jung glimpsed but couldn't fully articulate. The feminine principle at its most developed is what mystics call the void, the emptiness that contains all potential, the darkness that gestates all creation, the silence from which all wisdom emerges. This isn't relational in the conventional sense. It's prior to relationship. It's the ground from which relationship emerges, but isn't dependent on it. Women accessing this level of feminine consciousness terrify the patriarchal order because they've accessed the source. They no longer need priests, gurus, partners, or authorities to mediate their connection to the sacred. They are the sacred embodied, the evolution of love itself. Here's what most people miss. Women individuating beyond relationship aren't rejecting love, they're evolving it. Love based on need isn't actually love, it's dependency with prettier language. Real love, Jung believed, can only occur between two people who don't need each other for completion, but choose connection from wholeness. As women complete their internal hieroskamos, they become capable of a quality of love that's rare in human history. Love without projection, without need, without losing themselves. This evolution of love from unconscious fusion to conscious union is essential for humanity's next stage of development, because the challenges humanity faces, ecological crisis, technological transformation, collective trauma, require a level of consciousness that dependent, fragmented people cannot provide. We need whole humans, and women's wholeness beyond relationship is key to that emergence. The archetypal shift from maiden mother to crone-wise woman. Collectively, feminine consciousness has been stuck in the maiden mother binary for centuries. Women are valued as young and beautiful, maiden, or as mothers serving the next generation. The crone, the post-relational wise woman who serves consciousness rather than biological or relational imperatives, has been systematically erased from culture. But Jung predicted this archetype would return, had to return, because the crone carries wisdom the maiden and mother cannot access. She knows death. She's beyond seduction. She's beyond manipulation through promise of love or threat of abandonment. She speaks truth because she has nothing left to lose. As more women individuate beyond relationship and embody the crone archetype, regardless of their biological age, this frequency reactivates in the collective unconscious, and the crone's return changes everything. She midwifes transformation. She speaks what others cannot. She holds space for the death that precedes rebirth. Humanity desperately needs the crone, and she's emerging through every woman brave enough to complete this individuation.